Book 10. The House is Perfected. Chapters 107 to 122. Our mobile column of aeroplanes, armored cars, Arab regulars and Bedouin collected at Azraq, to cut the 3 railways out of Dira. The southern line we cut near Mafraq, the northern at Arar. The western by Mezarib. We circumnavigated Dira, and rallied, despite air raids, in the desert. Next day Allenby attacked, and in a few hours had scattered the Turkish armies beyond recovery. I flew to Palestine for aeroplane help, and got orders for a second phase of the thrust northward. We moved behind Dira to hasten its abandonment. General Barrow joined us. In his company we advanced to Kiswi, and there met the Australian Mounted Corps. Our united forces entered Damascus unopposed. Some confusion manifested itself in the city. We strove to allay it. Allenby arrived and smoothed out all difficulties. Afterwards he let me go. Chapter 107. It was an inexpressible pleasure to have left the mists behind. We caught at each other with thankfulness as we drove along, Winterton, Nasir and myself. Lord Winterton was our last found recruit. An experienced officer from Buxton's Camel Corps. Sharif Nasir, who had been the spear point of the Arab army since the first days of Medina, had been chosen by us for the field work on this last occasion also. He deserved the honor of Damascus, for his had been the honors of Medina, of Wage, of Aqaba, and of Tafili, and of many barren days beside. A painstaking little Ford hung on in the dust, behind, as our splendid car drank up the familiar miles. Once I had been proud of riding from Azraq to Aqaba in 3 days, but now we drove it in 2, and slept well of nights after this mournful comfort of being born at ease in Rolls-Royces, like the great ones of war. We noted again how easy their lives were. The soft body and its unexhausted sinews helping the brain to concentrate upon an armchair work, whereas our brains and bodies lay down only for the stupor of an hour's sleep, in the flush of dawn and the flush of sunset. The 2 seasons of the day unwholesome for riding. Many a day we had been 22 out of the 24 hours in the saddle, each taking it in turn to lead through the darkness while the others let their heads nod forward over the pommel in nescience. Not that it was more than a thin nescience, for even in the deepest of such sleep the foot went on pressing the camel's shoulder to keep it at the cross-country pace. And the rider awoke if the balance were lost ever so little at a false stride or turn. Then we had had rain, snow or sun beating upon us, little food, little water, and no security against either Turks or Arabs. Yet those forced months with the tribes had let me plan in a surety which seemed lunatic rashness to newcomers, but actually was an exact knowledge of my materials. Now the desert was not normal, indeed, it was shamefully popular. We were never out of sight of men, of tenuous camel columns of troops and tribesmen and baggage moving slowly northward over the interminable Jifar flat. Past this activity, of good omen for our punctual concentration at Azraq, we roared, my excellent driver, Green, once achieving 67 miles an hour. The half-stifled Nasir who sat in the box body could only wave his hand across a furlong to each friend we overtook. At Beir we heard from the alarmed Beni Sakr that the Turks, on the preceding day, had launched suddenly westward from Hiza into Tafili. Mifla thought I was mad, or most untimely merry, when I laughed outright at the news which 4 days sooner would have held up the Azraq expedition, but, now we were started, the enemy might take Aba el Lisan, Gawera, Aqaba itself, and welcome. Our formidable talk of advance by Amman had pulled their leg nearly out of socket, and the innocents were out to counter our feint. Each man they sent south was a man, or rather 10 men, lost. In Azraq we found a few servants of Nuri Shah Alan, and the Crossley car with a flying officer, an airman, some spares, and a canvas hangar for the 2 machines protecting our concentration. We spent our first night on their aerodrome and suffered for it. A reckless armor-plated camel fly, biting like a hornet, occupied our exposed parts till sunset. Then came a blessed relief as the itch grew milder in the evening cool, but the wind changed and hot showers of blinding salty dust swept us for 3 hours. We lay down and drew covers over our heads, but could not sleep. Each half-hour we had to throw off the sand which threatened to bury us. At midnight the wind ceased. We issued from our sweaty nests and restfully prepared to sleep, when, singing, a cloud of mosquitoes rolled over us. Then we fought till dawn. Consequently, at dawn we changed camp to the height of the Majaber Ridge, a mile west of the water and 100 feet above the marshes, open to all winds that blew. We rested a while, then put up the hanger, and afterwards went off to bathe in the silver water. We undressed beside the sparkling pools whose pearl-white sides and floor reflected the sky with a moony radiance. Delicious! I yelled as I splashed in and swayed about. But why do you keep on bobbing under water? Asked Winterton a moment later. Then a camel-fly bit him behind, and he understood, and leapt in after me. We swam about, desperately keeping our heads wet, to dissuade the grey swarms, but they were too bold with hunger to be afraid of water, and after 5 minutes we struggled out, and frantically into our clothes. The blood running from 20 of their dagger bites. Nasir stood and laughed at us, and later we journeyed together to the fort, to rest midday there. Ali ibn el-Hussein's old corner tower, this only roof in the desert, was cool and peaceful. The wind stirred the palm fronds outside to a frosty rustling, neglected palms, too northerly for their red date crop to be good, but the stems were thick with low branches, and threw a pleasant shade. Under them, on his carpet, sat Nasir in the quietness. The grey smoke of his thrown-away cigarette undulated out on the warm air, flickering and fading through the sunspots which shone between the leaves. "I am happy," said he. We were all happy. In the afternoon an armored car came up, completing our necessary defense, though the risk of enemy was minute. 3 tribes covered the country between us and the railway. There were only 40 horsemen in Dira, none in Amman, also, as yet the Turks had no news of us. One of their aeroplanes flew over on the morning of the 9th, made a perfunctory circle, and went off, probably without seeing us. Our camp, on its airy summit, gave us splendid observation of the Dira and Amman roads. By day we 12 English, with Nasir and his slave, lazed, roaming, bathing at sunset, sightseeing, thinking. And slept comfortably at night, or rather I did, enjoying the precious interval between the conquered friends of Abal Lisan and the enemy of next month. The preciousness would seem to have been partly in myself, for on this march to Damascus, and such it was already in our imagination, my normal balance had changed. I could feel the taut power of Arab excitement behind me. The climax of the preaching of years had come, and the united country was straining towards its historic capital. In confidence that this weapon, tempered by myself, was enough for the utmost of my purpose, I seemed to forget the English companions who stood outside my idea in the shadow of ordinary war. I failed to make them partners of my certainty. Long after, I heard that Winterton rose each dawn and examined the horizon, lest my carelessness subject us to surprise, and that Umte and Sheikh Saad the British for days thought we were a forlorn hope. Actually I knew, and surely said, that we were as safe as anyone in the world at war. Because of the pride they had, I never saw their doubt of my plans. These plans were a feint against Amman and a real cutting of the Dira railways. Further than this we hardly went, for it was ever my habit, while studying alternatives, to keep the stages in solution. The public often gave credit to generals because it had seen only the orders and the result. Even Foch said, before he commanded troops, that generals won battles, but no general ever truly thought so. The Syrian campaign of September 1918 was perhaps the most scientifically perfect in English history, one in which force did least and brain most. All the world, and especially those who served them, gave the credit of the victory to Allenby and Bartholomew, but those two would never see it in our light, knowing how their inchoate ideas were discovered in application, and how their men, often not knowing, wrought them. By our establishment at Azraq the first part of our plan, the feint, was accomplished. We had sent our horsemen of St. George, gold sovereigns, by the thousand to the Beni Shakr, purchasing all the barley on their threshing floors, begging them not to mention it, but we would require it for our animals and for our British allies, in a fortnight. Diab of Tafili, that jerky, incomplete hobbledehoy, gossiped the news instantly through to Carrick. In addition, Faisal warned the Zebn to bear, for service. And Hornby, now, perhaps a little prematurely, wearing Arab clothes, was active in preparations for a great assault on Mediba. His plan was to move about the 19th, when he heard that Allenby was started. His hope being to tie on to Jericho, so that if we failed by Dira our force could return and reinforce his movement, which would then be, not a feint, but the old second string to our bow. However, the Turks knocked this rather crooked by their advance to Tafili, and Hornby had to defend Shobeck against them. For our second part, the Dira business, we had to plan an attack proper. As preliminary we determined to cut the line near Amman, thus preventing Amman's reinforcement of Dira, and maintaining its conviction that our feint against it was real. It seemed to me that, with Egyptians to do the actual destruction, this preliminary could be undertaken by the Gurkhas, whose detachment would not distract our main body from the main purpose. This main purpose was to cut the railways in the Horn and keep them cut for at least a week, and there seemed to be 3 ways of doing it. The first was to march north of Dira to the Damascus Railway, as on my ride with Taulal in the winter, cut it, and then cross to the Yarmouk Railway. The second was to march south of Dira to the Yarmouk, as with Ali ibn el-Hussein in November, 1917. The third was to rush straight at Dira town. The third scheme could be undertaken only if the Air Force would promise so heavy a daylight bombing of Dira station that the effect would be tantamount to artillery bombardment, enabling us to risk an assault against it with our few men. Salmond hoped to do this, but it depended on how many heavy machines he received or assembled in time. Donné would fly over to us here with his last word on September the 11th. Till then we would hold the schemes equal in our judgment. Of our supports, my bodyguard were the first to arrive, prancing up Wadi Sirhan on September the 9th, happy, fatter than their fat camels, rested, and amused after their month of feasting with the Ruala. They reported Nuri nearly ready, and determined to join us. The contagion of the new tribe's first vigor had quickened in them a me and spirit which made us jolly. On the 10th the 2 aeroplanes came through from Aqaba. Murphy and Junner, the pilots, settled down to the horseflies which gamboled in the air about their juiciness. On the 11th, the other armored cars and Joyce drove in, with Sterling, but without Faisal. Marshall had remained to squire him up next day, and things were always safe to go well where Marshall, the capable soul, directed them with a cultivated humor, which was not so much riotous as persistent. Young, Peake, Scott Higgins and the baggage arrived. Azraq became many-peopled and its lakes were again resonant with voices and the plunge of brown and lean, brown and strong, copper-colored, or white bodies into the transparent water. On the 11th the aeroplane from Palestine arrived. Unfortunately, Donné was again ill, and the staff officer who took his place, being raw, had suffered severely from the roughness of the air, and had left behind the notes he was to bring us. His rather concrete assurance, that regard upon his world of the finished Englishman, gave way before these shocks, and the final shock of our naked carelessness out there in the desert, without pickets or watching posts, signalers, sentries or telephones, or any apparent reserves, defense line, refuges and bases. So he forgot his most important news, how on September the 6th Allenby, with a new inspiration, had said to Bartholomew, "Why bother about Messidia? Let the cavalry go straight to Afuli, and Nazareth," and so the whole plan had been changed, and an enormous indefinite advance substituted for the fixed objective. We got no notion of this. But by cross-questioning the pilot, whom Salmond had informed, we got a clear statement of the resources in bombing machines. They fell short of our minimum for Dira. So we asked for just a hamper bombing of it while we went round it by the north, to make sure of destroying the Damascus line. The next day Faisal arrived with, behind him, the army of troops, Nuri said the spick and span, Jemal the gunner, Pisani's coster-like Algerians, and the other items of our 3 men and a boy effort. The grey flies had now 2,000 camels to fatten upon, and in their weariness gave up Junner and his half-drained mechanics. In the afternoon Nuri Shah Alan appeared, with Trad and Khalid, Paris, Durzi, and the Kafaji. Auda Abu Tay arrived, with Muhammad el-Dylan, also Fahad and Adhub, the Zebn leaders, with Ibn Bani, the chief of the Sarahin, and Ibn Genj of the Sirdia. Majid Ibn Sultan, of the Adwan near Salt, rode across to learn the truth of our attack on Amman. Later in the evening there was a rattle of rifle fire in the north, and Talal el-Haridan, my old companion, came ruffling at the gallop, with 40 or 50 mounted peasants behind him. His sanguine face beamed with joy at our long-hoped-for arrival. Druzes and town Syrians, Isawaya and Hawarna swelled the company. Even the barley for our return if the venture failed, a possibility we seldom entertained, began to arrive in a steady file of loads. Everyone was stout and in health. Except myself. The crowd had destroyed my pleasure in Azrak, and I went off down the valley to our remote Ain el-Asad and lay there all day in my old lair among the tamarisk, where the wind in the dusty green branches played with such sounds as it made in English trees. It told me I was tired to death of these Arabs, petty incarnate Semites who attained heights and depths beyond our reach, though not beyond our sight. They realized our absolute in their unrestrained capacity for good and evil. And for 2 years I had profitably shammed to be their companion. Today it came to me with finality that my patience as regards the false position I had been led into was finished. A week, 2 weeks, 3, and I would insist upon relief. My nerve had broken, and I would be lucky if the ruin of it could be hidden so long. Joyce meanwhile shouldered the responsibility which my defection endangered. By his orders Peake, with the Egyptian Camel Corps, now a sapper party, Scott Higgins, with his fighting Gurkhas, and 2 armored cars as insurance, went off to cut the railway by Iftian. The scheme was for Scott Higgins to rush a blockhouse after dark with his nimble Indians, nimble on foot that was to say, for they were like sacks, on camels. Peake was then to demolish until dawn. The cars would cover their retreat eastward in the morning, over the plain, upon which we, the main body, would be marching north from Azrak for Umtay, a great pit of rainwater 15 miles below Dira, and our advanced base. We gave them Ruala guides and saw them off, hopefully, for this important preliminary. Chapter 108. Just at dawn our column marched. Of them 1,000 were the Aba el Lisan contingent, 300 were Nuri Shalan's nomad horse. He had also 2,000 Ruala camel riders. These we asked him to keep in Wadi Sirhan. It seemed not wise, before the supreme day, to launch so many disturbing Bedouin among the villages of Horan. The horsemen were sheiks, or sheik servants, men of substance, under control. Affairs with Nuri and Faisal held me the whole day in Azrak, but Joyce had left me a tender, the Blue Mist, by which on the following morning I overtook the army, and found them breakfasting among the grass-filled roughness of the Jayan el-Kuna. The camels, joying to be out of the barren circle of Azrak, were packing their stomachs hastily with this best of food. Joyce had bad news. Peake had rejoined, reporting failure to reach the line, because of trouble with Arab encampments in the neighborhood of his proposed demolition. We had set store on breaking the Amman railway, and the check was an offense. I left the car, took a load of gun cotton, and mounted my camel, to push in advance of the force. The others made a detour to avoid harsh tongues of lava which ran down westwards towards the railway. But we, Ajail and others of the well-mounted, cut straight across by a thieves' path to the open plain about the ruined el-Jimel. I was thinking hard about the Amman demolition, puzzled as to what expedient would be quickest and best. And the puzzle of these ruins added to my care. There seemed evidence of bluntness of mind in these Roman frontier cities, el-Jimel, el-Shurab, Umtay. Such incongruous buildings, in what was then and now a desert cockpit, accused their builders of insensitiveness, almost of a vulgar assertion of man's right, Roman right, to live unchanged in all his estate. Italianate buildings, only to be paid for by taxing more docile provinces, on these fringes of the world disclosed a prosaic blindness to the transience of politics. A house which so survived the purpose of its builder was a pride too trivial to confer honor upon the mind responsible for its conception. el-Jimel seemed aggressive and impudent, and the railway beyond it so tiresomely intact, that they blinded me to an air battle between Murphy in our Bristol fighter and an enemy two-seater. The Bristol was badly shot about before the Turk went down in flames. Our army were delighted spectators, but Murphy, finding the damage too great for his few materials at Azraq, went for repair to Palestine in the morning. So our tiny air force was reduced to the B.E.12, a type so out of date that it was impossible for fighting, and little use for reconnaissance. This we discovered on the day. Meanwhile we were as glad as the army at our man's win. Umtay was reached, just before sunset. The troops were 5 or 6 miles behind, so as soon as our beasts had had a drink we struck off to the railway, for miles downhill to the westward, thinking to do a snatch demolition. The dusk let us get close without alarm, and, to our joy, we found that the going was possible for armored cars, while just before us were 2 good bridges. These points decided me to return in the morning, with cars and more gun cotton, to abolish the larger, 4-arched bridge. Its destruction would give the Turks some days' hard mending, and set us free of Amman all the time of our first Dera raid. Thus the purpose of Peake's frustrated demolition would be filled. It was a happy discovery, and we rode back, quartering the ground while the darkness gathered, to pick the best car road. As we climbed the last ridge, a high unbroken watershed which hid Umtay completely from the railway and its possible watchmen, the fresh northeast wind blew into our faces the warm smell and dust of 10,000 feet. And from the crest the ruins appeared so startlingly unlike themselves 3 hours before that we pulled up to gasp. The hollow ground was festively spangled with a galaxy of little evening fires, fresh lighted, still twinkling with the flame reflections in their smoke. About them men were making bread or coffee, while others drove their noisy camels to and from the water. I rode to the dark camp, the British one, and sat there with Joyce and Winterton and Young, telling them of what we must do first thing in the morning. Beside us lay and smoked the British soldiers, quietly risking themselves on this expedition, because we ordered it. It was a thing typical, as instinct with our national character as that babbling laughing turmoil over there was Arab. In their crises the one race drew in, the other spread. In the morning, while the army breakfasted, and thawed the dawn chill from its muscles in the sun, we explained to the Arab leaders in council the fitness of the line for a car raid. And it was determined that 2 armored cars should run down to the bridge and attack it, while the main body continued their march to Tel Arar on the Damascus Railway, for miles north of Dera. They would take post there, possessing the line, at dawn tomorrow, September the 17th, and we with the cars would have finished this bridge and rejoined them before that. About 2 in the afternoon, as we drove towards the railway, we had the great sight of a swarm of our bombing planes droning steadily up towards Dera on their first raid. The place had hitherto been carefully reserved from air attack. So the damage among the unaccustomed, unprotected, unarmed garrison was heavy. The morale of the men suffered as much as the railway traffic, until our onslaught from the north forced them to see us. All their efforts went into digging bomb-proof shelters. We lurched across plots of grass, between bars and fields of rough stone, in our 2 tenders and 2 armored cars, but arrived all well behind a last ridge, just this side of our target. On the rise south of the bridge stood a stone blockhouse. We settled to leave the tenders here, under cover. I transferred myself, with 150 pounds of gun cotton, fused and ready, to 1 armored car. Intending to drive passively down the valley towards the bridge, till its arches, sheltering us from the fire of the post, enabled me to lay and light the demolition charges. Meanwhile the other, the active fighting car, would engage the blockhouse at short range to cover my operation. The 2 cars set out simultaneously. When they saw us the astonished garrison of 7 or 8 Turks got out of their trenches, and, rifles in hand, advanced upon us in open order, moved either by panic, by misunderstanding, or by an inhuman unmixed courage. In a few minutes the second car came into action against them, while 4 other Turks appeared beside the bridge and shot at us. Our machine gunners ranged, and fired a short burst. 1 man fell, another was hit, the rest ran a little way, thought better of it, and returned, making friendly signs. We took their rifles, and sent them up valley to the tenders, whose drivers were watching us keenly from their ridge. The blockhouse surrendered at the same moment. We were very content to have taken the bridge, and its section of track, in 5 minutes without loss. Joyce rushed down in his tender with more gun cotton, and hastily we set about the bridge, a pleasant little work, 80 feet long and 15 feet high, honored with a shining slab of white marble, bearing the name and titles of Sultan Abd el-Hamid. In the drainage holes of the spandrels 6 small charges were inserted zigzag, and with their explosion all the arches were scientifically shattered. The demolition being a fine example of that finest sort which left the skeleton of its bridge intact indeed, but tottering, so that the repairing enemy had a first labor to destroy the wreck, before they could attempt to rebuild. When we had finished, enemy patrols were near enough to give us fair excuse for quitting. The few prisoners, whom we valued for intelligence reasons, were given place on our loads, and we bumped off. Unfortunately we bumped too carelessly in our satisfaction, and at the first watercourse there was a crash beneath my tender. One side of its box body tipped downward till the weight came on the tire at the back wheel, and we stuck. The front bracket of the near back spring had crystallized through by the chassis, in a sheer break which nothing but a workshop could mend. We gazed in despair, for we were only 300 yards from the railway, and stood to lose the car, when the enemy came along in 10 minutes. A Rolls in the desert was above rubies. And though we had been driving in these for 18 months, not upon the polished roads of their maker's intention, but across country of the vilest, at speed, day or night, carrying a ton of goods and 4 or 5 men up. Yet this was our first structural accident in the team of 9. Rolls, the driver, our strongest and most resourceful man, the ready mechanic, whose skill and advice largely kept our cars in running order, was nearly in tears over the mishap. The knot of us, officers and men, English, Arabs and Turks, crowded round him and watched his face anxiously. As he realized that he, a private, commanded in this emergency, even the stubble on his jaw seemed to harden in sullen determination. At last he said there was just one chance. We might jack up the fallen end of the spring, and wedge it, by balks upon the running board, in nearly its old position. With the help of ropes the thin angle irons of the running boards might carry the additional weight. We had on each car a length of scantling to place between the double tires if ever the car stuck in sand or mud. 3 blocks of this would make the needful height. We had no saw, but drove bullets through it crosswise till we could snap it off. The Turks heard us firing, and halted cautiously. Joyce heard us and ran back to help. Into his car we piled our load, jacked up the spring in the chassis, lashed in the wooden balks, let her down on them, they bore splendidly, cranked up, and drove off. Rolls eased her to walking speed at every stone and ditch, while we, prisoners and all, ran beside with cries of encouragement, clearing the track. In camp we stitched the blocks with captured telegraph wire, and bound them together into the chassis, and the spring to the chassis, till it looked as strong as possible, and we put back the load. So enduring was the running board that we did the ordinary work with the car for the next 3 weeks, and took her so into Damascus at the end. Great was Rolls, and great was Royce. They were worth hundreds of men to us in these deserts. This darning the car delayed us for hours, and at its end we slept in Umte, confident that, by starting before dawn, we should not be much late in meeting Nuri said on the Damascus line tomorrow, and we could tell him that, for a week. The Amman line was sealed, by loss of a main bridge. This was the side of quickest reinforcement for Dira, and its death made our rear safe. Even we had helped poor Zaid, behind there in Aba el-Lisan, for the Turks massed in Tafili would hold up that attack till their communications were again open. Our last campaign was beginning auspiciously. Chapter 109. Duly, before dawn, we drove upon the track of Sterling's cars, eager to be with them before their fight. Unfortunately the going was not helpful. At first we had a bad descent, and then difficult flats of jagged dolerite, across which we crawled painfully. Later we ran over plowed slopes. The soil was heavy for the cars, for with summer drought this red earth cracked a yard deep and 2 or 3 inches wide. The 5-ton armored cars were reduced to first speed, and nearly stuck. We overtook the Arab army about 8 in the morning, on the crest of the slope to the railway, as it was deploying to attack the little bridge-guarding redoubt between us and the mound of Tel Erer whose head overlooked the countryside to Dira. Ruala horsemen, led by Trad, dashed down the long slope and over the licorice-grown bed of the watercourse to the line. Young bounced after them in his ford. From the ridge we thought the railway taken without a shot, but while we gazed, suddenly from the neglected Turkish post came a vicious spitting fire, and our braves, who had been standing in splendid attitudes on the coveted line, wondering privately what on earth to do next, disappeared. Nuri said moved down Pisani's guns and fired a few shots. Then the Ruala and troops rushed the redoubt easily, with only one killed. So the southern 10 miles of the Damascus line was freely ours by 9 in the morning. It was the only railway to Palestine and Hijaz, and I could hardly realize our fortune, hardly believe that our word to Allenby was fulfilled so simply and so soon. The Arabs streamed down from the ridge in rivers of men, and swarmed upon the round head of Tel Erer, to look over their plain, whose rimmed flatness the early sun speciously relieved, by yet throwing more shadow than light. Our soldiers could see Dira, Mezarib and Ghazal, the 3 key stations, with their naked eyes. I was seeing further than this, northward to Damascus, the Turkish base, their only link with Constantinople and Germany, now cut off, southward to Amman and Man in Medina. All cut off, westward to Lyman von Sandar's isolated in Nazareth, to Nablus, to the Jordan Valley. Today was September the 17th, the promised day, 48 hours before Allenby would throw forward his full power. In 48 hours the Turks might decide to change their dispositions to meet our new danger. But they could not change them before Allenby struck. Bartholomew had said, "Tell me if he will be in his Auja line the day before we start, and I will tell you if we will win." Well, he was, so we would win. The question was by how much. I wanted the whole line destroyed in a moment, but things seemed to have stopped. The army had done its share, Nuri said was posting machine guns about the Erer mound to keep back any sortie from Dira, but why was there no demolition going on? I rushed down, to find Peake's Egyptians making breakfast. It was like Drake's game of bowls, and I fell dumb with admiration. However, in an hour they were mustered for their rhythmic demolition by numbers. And already the French gunners, who also carried gun cotton, had descended with intention upon the near bridge. They were not very good, but at the second try did it some hurt. From the head of Tel Erer, before the mirage had begun to dance, we examined Dira carefully through my strong glass, wanting to see what the Turks had in store for us this day. The first discovery was disturbing. Their aerodrome was alive with gangs pulling machine after machine into the open. I could count 8 or 9 lined up. Otherwise things were as we expected. Some few infantry were doubling out into the defense position, and their guns were being fired towards us, but we were 4 miles off. Locomotives were getting up steam, but the trains were unarmored. Behind us, towards Damascus, the country lay still as a map. From Mezarib on our right, there was no movement. We held the initiative. Our hope was to fire 600 charges, tulip fashion, putting out of commission 6 kilometers of rail. Tulips had been invented by Peake and myself for this occasion. 30 ounces of gun cotton were planted beneath the center of the central sleeper of each 10-meter section of the track. The sleepers were steel, and their box shape left an air chamber which the gas expansion filled, to blow the middle of the sleeper upward. If the charge was properly laid, the metal did not snap, but humped itself, bud-like, 2 feet in the air. The lift of it pulled the rails 3 inches up, the drag of it pulled them 6 inches together, and, as the chairs gripped the bottom flanges, warped them inward seriously. The triple distortion put them beyond repair. 3 or 5 sleepers would be likewise ruined, and a trench driven across the earthwork, all this with 1 charge, fired by a fuse, so short that the first, blowing off while the third was being lighted, cast its debris safely overhead. 600 such charges would take the Turks a fair week to mend. This would be a generous reading of Allenby's 3 Men and a Boy with Pistols. I turned to go back to the troops, and at that moment 2 things happened. Peake fired his first charge, like a poplar tree of black smoke, with a low following report, and the first Turkish machine got up and came for us. Nuri said and I fitted admirably under an outcrop of rock, fissured into deep natural trenches, on the hill's southern face. There we waited coolly for the bomb, but it was only a reconnaissance machine, up falls, which studied us, and returned to Dira with its news. Bad news it must have been, for 3 two-seaters, and 4 scouts and an old yellow-bellied albatros got up in quick succession, and circled over us, dropping bombs, or diving at us with machine-gun fire. Nuri put his Hotchkiss gunners in the rock cracks, and rattled back at them. Pisani cocked up his 4 mountain guns, and let fly some optimistic shrapnel. This disturbed the enemy, who circled off, and came back much higher. Their aim became uncertain. We scattered out the troops and camels, while the irregulars scattered themselves. To open into the thinnest target was our only hope of safety, as the plane had not overhead cover for a rabbit. And our hearts misgave us when we saw what thousands of men we had, dotted out below. It was strange to stand on the hilltop looking at these 2 rolling square miles, liberally spread with men and animals. And bursting out irregularly with lazy silent bulbs of smoke where bombs dropped, seemingly quite apart from their thunder, or with sprays of dust where machine-gun groups lashed down. Things looked and sounded hot, but the Egyptians went on working as methodically as they had eaten. 4 parties dug in tulips, while Peake and one of his officers lit each series as it was laid. The 2 slabs of gun cotton in a tulip charge were not enough to make a showy explosion, and the aeroplanes seemed not to see what was going on, at least they did not wash them particularly with bombs. And as the demolition proceeded, the party drew gradually out of the danger area into the quiet landscape to the north. We traced their progress by the degradation of the telegraph. In virgin parts its poles stood trimly, drilled by the taut wire, but behind Peake they leaned and tottered anyhow, or fell. Nuri said, Joyce and myself met in council, and pondered how to get at the Yarmouk section of the Palestine line to top off our cutting of the Damascus and Hijaz railways. In view of the reported opposition there we must take nearly all our men, which seemed hardly wise under such constant air observation. For one thing, the bombs might hurt us badly on the march across the open plain. And, for another, Peake's demolition party would be at the mercy of Dira if the Turks plucked up the courage to sally. For the moment they were fearful, but time might make them brave. While we hesitated, things were marvelously solved. Junner, the pilot of the B.E.12 machine, now alone at Azraq, had heard from the disabled Murphy of the enemy machines about Dira, and in his own mind decided to take the Bristol fighter's place, and carry out the air program. So when things were at their thickest with us he suddenly sailed into the circus. We watched with mixed feelings, for his hopelessly old-fashioned machine made him cold meat for any one of the enemy scouts or two-seaters, but at first he astonished them, as he rattled in with his 2 guns. They scattered for a careful look at this unexpected opponent. He flew westward across the line, and they went after in pursuit, with that amiable weakness of aircraft for a hostile machine, however important the ground target. We were left in perfect peace. Nuri caught at the lull to collect 350 regulars, with 2 of Pisani's guns, and hurried them over the saddle behind Tel Er, on the first stage of their march to Mezrib. If the aeroplanes gave us a half-hour's law, they would probably notice neither the lessened numbers by the mound, nor the scattered groups making along every slope and hollow across the stubble westward. This cultivated land had a quilt-work appearance from the air, also the ground was tall with maize stalks, and thistles grew saddle-high about it in great fields. We sent the peasantry after the soldiers, and half an hour later I was calling up my bodyguard that we might get to Mezrib before the others, when again we heard the drone of engines. And, to our astonishment, Junner reappeared, still alive, though attended on 3 sides by enemy machines, spitting bullets. He was twisting and slipping splendidly, firing back. Their very numbers hindered them, but of course the affair could have only one ending. In the faint hope that he might get down intact, we rushed towards the railway, where was a strip of ground, not too boulder-strewn. Everyone helped to clear it at speed, while Gunnar was being driven lower. He threw us a message to say his petrol was finished. We worked feverishly for 5 minutes, and then put out a landing signal. He dived at it, but as he did so the wind flawed and blew across at a sharp angle. The cleared strip was too little in any case. He took ground beautifully, but the wind puffed across once more. His undercarriage went, and the plane turned over in the rough. We rushed up to rescue, but Gunnar was out, with no more hurt than a cut on the chin. He took off his Lewis gun, and the Vickers, and the drums of tracer ammunition for them. We threw everything into Young's Ford, and fled, as one of the Turkish two-seaters dived viciously and dropped a bomb by the wreck. Gunnar 5 minutes later was asking for another job. Joyce gave him a Ford for himself, and he ran boldly down the line till near Dira, and blew a gap in the rails there, before the Turks saw him. They found such zeal excessive, and opened on him with their guns, but he rattled away again in his Ford, unhurt for the 3rd time. Chapter 110. My bodyguard waited in 2 long lines on the hillside. Joyce was staying at Tel Erer as covering force, with 100 of Nuri Set's men, the Ruala, the Gurkhas and the Kars, while we slipped across to break the Palestine railway. My party would look like Bedouins, so I determined to move openly to Mezrib by the quickest course, for we were very late. Unfortunately we drew enemy attention. An aeroplane crawled over us, dropping bombs, 1, 2, 3, misses, the 4th into our midst. 2 of my men went down. Their camels, in bleeding masses, struggled on the ground. The men had not a scratch, and leaped up behind 2 of their friends. Another machine floated past us, its engine cut off. 2 more bombs, and a shock which spun my camel round, and knocked me half out of the saddle with a burning numbness in my right elbow. I felt I was hard hit, and began to cry for the pity of it, to be put out just when another day's control would have meant a vast success. The blood was running down my arm, perhaps if I did not look at it I might carry on as if I were unhurt. My camel swung to a spatter of machine gun bullets. I clutched at the pommel, and found my damaged arm there inefficient. I had judged it blown off. My left hand threw the cloak aside and explored for the wound, to feel only a very hot little splinter of metal, too light to do real harm after driving through the massed folds of my cloak. The trifle showed how much my nerve was on edge. Curiously enough, it was the first time I had been hit from the air. We opened out and rode greatly, knowing the ground by heart, checking only to tell the young peasants we met that the work was now at Mezrib. The field paths were full of these fellows, pouring out afoot from every village to help us. They were very willing, but our eyes had rested so long on the brown leanness of desert men that these gay village lads with their flushed faces, clustering hair, and plump pale arms and legs seemed like girls. They had kilted up their gowns above the knee for fast work, and the more active raced beside us through the fields, chaffing back my veterans. As we reached Mezrib, Durzi ibn Dugmi met us, with news that Nuri Set's soldiers were only 2 miles back. We watered our camels, and drank deeply ourselves, for it had been a long, hot day, and was not ended. Then from behind the old fort we looked over the lake, and saw movement in the French railway station. Some of the white-legged fellows told us that the Turks held it in force. However, the approaches were too tempting. Abdullah led our charge, for my days of adventure were ended, with the sluggard excuse that my skin must be kept for a justifying emergency. Otherwise I wanted to enter Damascus. This job was too easy. Abdullah found grain, also flour. And some little booty of weapons, horses, ornaments. These excited my hangers-on. New adherents came running across the grass, like flies to honey. Taulal arrived at his constant gallop. We passed the stream, and walked together up the far bank knee-deep in weeds till we saw the Turkish station 300 yards in front. We might capture this before attacking the great bridge below Tel el-Shahab. Taulal advanced carelessly. Turks showed themselves to right and left. "It's all right," said he, "I know the station master," but when we were 200 yards away, 20 rifles fired a shocking volley at us. We dropped unhurt into the weeds, nearly all of them thistles, and crawled gingerly back, Talal swearing. My men heard him, or the shots, and came streaming up from the river, but we returned them, fearing a machine gun in the station buildings. Nuri said was due. He arrived with Nasir, and we considered the business. Nuri pointed out that delay at Mezrib might lose us the bridge, a greater objective. I agreed, but thought this bird in hand might suffice, since Peak's main line demolition would stand for a week, and the week's end bring a new situation. So Pisani unfolded his willing guns and smashed in a few rounds a point-blank high explosive. Under their cover, with our 20 machine guns making a roof overhead, Nuri walked forward, gloved and sword, to receive the surrender of the 40 soldiers left alive. Upon this most rich station hundreds of Horani peasants hurled themselves in frenzy, plundering. Men, women and children fought like dogs over every object. Doors and windows, door frames and window frames, even steps of the stairs, were carried off. One hopeful blew in the safe and found postage stamps inside. Others smashed open the long range of wagons in the siding, to find all manner of goods. Tons were carried off. Yet more were strewn in wreckage on the ground. Young and I cut the telegraph, here an important network of trunk and local lines, indeed the Palestine army's main link with their homeland. It was pleasant to imagine Linnen von Sandar's fresh curse, in Nazareth, as each severed wire tanged back from the clippers. We did them slowly, with ceremony, to draw out the indignation. The Turks' hopeless lack of initiative made their army a directed one, so that by destroying the telegraphs we went far towards turning them into a leaderless mob. After the telegraph we blew in the points, and planted tulips, not very many, but enough to annoy. While we worked a light engine came down the line from Dira on patrol. The bang and dust clouds of our tulips perturbed it. It withdrew discreetly. Later an aeroplane visited us. Among the captured rolling stock, on platform trucks, were 2 lorries crammed with delicacies for some German canteen. The Arabs, distrusting tins and bottles, had spoiled nearly everything, but we got some soups and meat, and later Nuri said gave us bottled asparagus. He had found an Arab prizing open the case and had cried "pigs' bones" at him in horror when the contents came to light. The peasant spat and dropped it, and Nuri quickly stuffed all he could into his saddlebags. The lorries had huge petrol tanks. Beyond them were some trucks of firewood. We set the whole afire at sunset, when the plundering was finished, and the troops and tribesmen had fallen back to the soft grass by the outlet from the lake. The splendid blaze spreading along the line of wagons illuminated our evening meal. The wood burned with a solid glare, and the fiery tongues and bursts of the petrol went towering up, higher than the water tanks. We let the men make bread and sup and rest, before a night attempt on the Shahab Bridge, which lay 3 miles to the westward. We had meant to attack at dark, but the wish for food stopped us, and then we had swarms of visitors, for our beacon light advertised us over half Horan. Visitors were our eyes, and had to be welcomed. My business was to see every one with news, and let him talk himself out to me, afterwards arranging and combining the truth of these points into a complete picture in my mind. Complete, because it gave me certainty of judgment, but it was not conscious nor logical, for my informants were so many that they informed me to distraction, and my single mind bent under all its claims. Men came pouring down from the north on horse, on camel, and on foot, hundreds and hundreds of them in a terrible grandeur of enthusiasm, thinking this was the final occupation of the country. And that Nasir would seal his victory by taking Dira in the night. Even the magistrates of Dira came to open us their town. By acceding we should hold the water supply of the railway station, which must inevitably yield, yet later, if the ruin of the Turkish army came but slowly, we might be forced out again, and lose the plainsmen between Dira and Damascus, in whose hands our final victory lay. A nice calculation, if hardly a fresh one, but on the whole the arguments were still against taking Dira. Again we had to put off our friends with excuses within their comprehension. Chapter 111. Slow Work. And when at last we were ready, a new visitor appeared, the boy chief of Tel el-Shahab. His village was the key to the bridge. He described the position, the large guard, how it was placed. Obviously the problem was harder than we had believed, if his tale was true. We doubted it, for his just dead father had been hostile, and the son sounded too suddenly devoted to our cause. However, he finished by suggesting that he return after an hour with the officer commanding the garrison, a friend of his. We sent him off to bring his Turk, telling our waiting men to lie down for another brief rest. Soon the boy was back with a captain, an Armenian, anxious to harm his government in any way he could. Also he was very nervous. We had hard work to assure him of our enlightenment. His subalterns, he said, were loyal Turks, and some of the non-commissioned officers. He proposed we move close to the village, and lie there secretly, while 3 or 4 of our lustiest men hid in his room. He would call his subordinates one by one to see him, and, as each entered, our ambush might pinion him. This sounded in the proper descent from books of adventure, and we agreed enthusiastically. It was 9 at night. At 11 precisely we would line up round the village and wait for the sheik to show our strong men to the commandant's house. The 2 conspirators departed, content, while we woke up our army, asleep with the sleep of exhaustion beside their loaded camels. It was pitchy dark. My bodyguard prepared bridge-cutting charges of gelatin. I filled my pockets with detonators. Nasir sent men to each section of the camel corps to tell them of the coming adventure, that they might work themselves up to the height of it, and to ensure their mounting quietly, without the disaster of a roaring camel. They played up. In a long double line our force crept down a winding path, beside an irrigation ditch, on the crest of the dividing ridge. If there was treachery before us, this bare road would be a death trap, without issue to right or left, narrow, tortuous, and slippery with the ditch water. So Nasir and I went first with our men, their trained ears attentive to every sound, their eyes keeping constant guard. In front of us was the waterfall, whose burdening roar had given its character to that unforgettable night with Ali ibn el-Hussein when we had attempted this bridge from the other wall of the ravine. Only tonight we were nearer, so that the noise flooded up oppressively and filled our ears. We crept very slowly and carefully now, soundless on our bare feet, while behind us the heavier soldiery snaked along, holding their breath. They also were soundless, for camels moved always stilly at night, and we had packed the equipment not to tap, the saddles not to creak. Their quietness made the dark darker, and deepened the menace of those whispering valleys either side. Waves of dank air from the river met us, chilly in our faces, and then Rahel came down swiftly from the left and caught my arm, pointing to a slow column of white smoke rising from the valley. We ran to the edge of the descent, and peered over, but the depth was grey with mist risen off the water, and we saw only dimness and this pale vapor spiring from the level fog bank. Somewhere down there was the railway, and we stopped the march, afraid lest this be the suspected trap. 3 of us went foot by foot down the slippery hillside till we could hear voices. Then suddenly the smoke broke and shifted, with the panting of an open throttle, and afterwards the squealing of brakes as an engine came again to a standstill. There must be a long train waiting beneath. Reassured, we marched again to the very spur below the village. We extended in line across its neck, and waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes. They passed slowly. The murk night before moonrise was hushing in its solidity, and would have compelled patience on our restless fellows, without the added warnings of the dogs, and the intermittent ringing challenge of sentries about the bridge. At length we let the men slip quietly from their camels to the ground, and sat wondering at the delay, and the Turks' watchfulness, and the meaning of that silent train standing below us in the valley. Our woolen cloaks got stiff and heavy with the mist, and we shivered. After a long while a lighter speck came through the dark. It was the boy sheik, holding his brown cloak open to show us his white shirt like a flag. He whispered that his plan had failed. A train, this one in the ravine, had just arrived with a German colonel and the German and Turk reserves from a Fuly, sent up by Lyman von Sandars, to rescue panic-stricken Dira. They had put the little Armenian under arrest for being absent from his post. There were machine guns galore, and sentries patrolling the approaches with ceaseless energy. In fact, there was a strong picket on the path, not 100 yards from where we sat. The oddity of our joint state made me laugh, though quietly. Nuri said offered to take the place by main force. We had bombs enough, and pistol flares. Numbers and preparedness would be on our side. It was a fair chance, but I was at the game of reckoning the value of the objective in terms of life, and as usual finding it too dear. Of course, most things done in war were too dear, and we should have followed good example by going in and going through with it. But I was secretly and disclaimedly proud of the planning of our campaigns, so I told Nuri that I voted against it. We had today twice cut the Damascus-Palestine railway, and the bringing here of the Afuli garrison was a third benefit to Allenby. Our bond had been most heavily honored. Nuri, after a moment's thought, agreed. We said good night to the lad who had honestly tried to do so much for us. We passed down the lines, whispering to each man to lead back in silence. Then we sat in a group with our rifles, mine Enver's gold-inscribed Lee Enfield trophy from the Dardanelles, given by him to Faisal years ago, waiting till our men should be beyond the danger zone. Oddly enough, this was the hardest moment of the night. Now the work was over, we could scarcely resist the temptation to rouse the spoilsport Germans out. It would have been so easy to have cracked off a very light into their bivouac. And the solemn men would have turned out in ludicrous hurry, and shot hard into the bare, misty hillsides silent at their feet. The identical notion came independently to Nasir, Nuri said, and myself. We blurted it out together, and each promptly felt ashamed that the others had been as childish. By mutual cautions we managed to keep our respectability. At Mezarib, after midnight, we felt that something must be done to avenge the forfeited bridge. So 2 parties of my fellows, with guides of Talil's men, went beyond Shahab, and cut the line twice behind it on deserted gradients. Their echoing explosions gave the German detachment a bad night. Flares were lit and the neighborhood searched for some brewing attack. We were glad to give them as tiresome a night as ours, for then they too would be languid in the morning. Our friends were still coming in every minute, to lass our hands and swear eternal fealty. Their wiry ponies threaded our misted camp, between the hundreds of sleeping men, and the uneasy camels whose great jaws were munching all night at the windy grass swallowed in the day hours. Before dawn Pisani's other guns and the rest of Nuri Sed's troops arrived from Tel Arar. We had written to Joyce that on the morrow we would return southward, by Nizib, to complete the circle of Dira. I suggested that he move straight back to and there wait for us, for it, with its abundant water, splendid pasture, and equidistance from Dira and Jebel Druze and the Ruala desert, seemed an ideal place in which we might rally and wait news of Allenby's fortune. By holding we as good as cut off the Turkish Fourth Army beyond Jordan, our special bird, from Damascus, and were in place quickly to renew our mainline demolitions, whenever the enemy had nearly set them right. Chapter 112. Reluctantly we pulled ourselves together for another day of effort, called up the army, and moved in a huge straggle through Mezarib station. Our fires had burned out, and the place stood disheveled. Young and myself leisurely laid tulips, while the troops melted into broken ground towards Remda, to be out of sight of both Dira and Shahab. Turkish aeroplanes were humming overhead, looking for us, so we sent our peasants back through Mezarib for their villages. Consequently, the airmen reported that we were very numerous, possibly 8,000 or 9,000 strong, and that our centrifugal movements seemed to be directed towards every direction at once. To increase their wonderment, the French gunners' long-fused charge blew up the water tower at Mezarib, loudly, hours after we had passed. The Germans were marching out of Shahab for Dira, at the moment, and the inexplicable shock sent these humorless ones back there on guard till late afternoon. Meanwhile we were far away, plodding steadily towards Nizib, whose hilltop we reached about 4 in the afternoon. We gave the mounted infantry a short rest, while we moved our gunners and machine guns to the crest of the first ridge, from which the ground fell away hollowly to the railway station. We posted the guns there in shelter, and asked them to open deliberately upon the station buildings at 2,000 yards. Pisani's sections worked in emulation so that, before long, ragged holes appeared in the roofs and sheds. At the same time we pushed our machine gunners forward on the left, to fire long bursts against the trenches, which returned a hot obstinate fire. However, our troops had natural shelter and the advantage of the afternoon sun behind their backs. So we suffered no hurt. Nor did the enemy. Of course, all this was just a game, and the capture of the station not in our plan. Our real objective was the great bridge north of the village. The ridge below our feet curved out in a long horn to this work, serving as one bank of the valley which it was built to span. The village stood on the other bank. The Turks held the bridge by means of a small redoubt, and maintained touch with it by riflemen posted in the village under cover of its walls. We turned 2 of Pisani's guns and 6 machine guns on the small but deeply dug bridge post, hoping to force its defenders out. 5 machine guns directed their fire on the village. In 15 minutes its elders were out with us, very much perturbed. Nuri put, as the condition of ceasefire, their instant ejectment of the Turks from the houses. They promised. So station and bridge were divided. We redoubled against these. The firing from the 4 wings became violent, thanks to our 25 machine guns, the Turks also being plentifully supplied. At last we put all 4 of Pisani's guns against the redoubt. And, after a few salvos, thought we saw its guards slipping from their battered trenches through the bridge into cover of the railway embankment. This embankment was 20 feet high. If the bridge guard chose to defend their bridge through its arches, they would be in a costly position. However, we reckoned that the attraction of their fellows in the station would draw them away. I told off the half of my bodyguard, carrying explosives, to move along the machine gun crest till within a stone's throw of the redoubt. It was a noble evening, yellow, mild and indescribably peaceful, a foil to our incessant cannonade. The declining light shone down the angle of the ridges, its soft rays modeling them and their least contour in a delicate complexity of planes. Then the sun sank another second, and the surface became shadow, out of which for a moment there rose, starkly, the innumerable flints strewing it, each western, reflecting, facet tipped like a black diamond with flame. A very unfit afternoon for dying, seemed to think my men, for the first time their nerves failed, and they refused to quit their shelter for the enemy's clattering bullets. They were tired, and their camels so marched out they could only walk. Also they knew that one bullet in the blasting gelatin would send them sky-high. A try to stir them by jest failed, at last I cast them off. Choosing only Hamid, the young and timid one amongst them, to come up with me on the hilltop. He shook like a man in a sick dream, but followed quietly. We rode down the ridge to its furthest edge, to have a close look at the bridge. Nuri said was there, sucking his briar pipe, and cheering the gunners, who were keeping a barrage over the darkening roads between the bridge, the village and the station. Nuri, being happy, propounded to me plans of attack and alternative assaults against this station, which we did not wish to assault. We argued theory for 10 minutes on the skyline, with Hamid wincing in his saddle as bullets, some of which were overs, spat past us, or ricochets hummed like slow, angry bees beside our ears. The few proper hits splashed loudly into the flints, kicking up a chalk dust which hung transparently for a moment in the reflected light. Nuri agreed to cover my movements to the bridge as well as he could. Then I turned Hamid back with my camel, to tell the rest that I would hurt them worse than bullets if they did not follow him across the danger zone to meet me, for I meant to walk round till I could be sure the bridge post was empty. While they hesitated, there came up Abdullah, the imperturbable, improvident, adventurous, who feared nothing, and the Zaghi. They, mad with fury that I had been let down, dashed at the shrinkers, who pounded over the shoulder with only 6 bullet scratches. The redoubt was indeed abandoned, so we dismounted, and signaled Nuri to cease fire. In the silence we crept discreetly through the bridge arches, and found them also evacuated. Hurriedly we piled gun cotton against the piers, which were about 5 feet thick and 25 feet high. A good bridge, my 79th, and strategically most critical, since we were going to live opposite it at Umte until Allenby came forward and relieved us. So I had determined to leave not a stone of it in place. Nuri meanwhile was hurrying the infantry, gunners and machine gunners down in the thickening light, towards the line, with orders to get a mile beyond into the desert, form up into column and wait. Yet the passing of so many camels over the track must take tediously long. We sat and chafed under the bridge, matches in hand, to light at once, despite the troops, if there was an alarm. Fortunately everything went well, and after an hour Nuri gave me my signal. Half a minute later, my preference for 6-inch fuses. Just as I tumbled into the Turkish redoubt, the 800 pounds of stuff exploded in one burst, and the black air became sibilant with flying stones. The explosion was numbing from my 20 yards, and must have been heard halfway to Damascus. Nuri, in great distress, sought me out. He had given the all-clear signal before learning that one company of mounted infantry was missing. Fortunately my guards were aching for redeeming service. Talal el-Haraidan took them with him up the hills, while Nuri and I stood by the yawning pit which had been the bridge, and flashed an electric torch, to give them a fixed point for their return. Mahmud came back in half an hour triumphantly leading the lost unit. We fired shots to recall the other searchers, and then rode 2 or 3 miles into the open towards Umte. The going became very broken, over moraines of slipping dolerite, so we gladly called a halt, and lay down in our ranks for an earned sleep. Chapter 113. However, it seemed that Nasir and I were to lose the habit of sleeping. Our noise at Nizib had proclaimed us as widely as the flames of Mezarib. Hardly were we still when visitors came streaming in from 3 sides to discuss the latest events. It was being rumored that we were raiding, and not occupying. That later we would run away, as had the British from Salt, leaving our local friends to pay the bills. The night, for hour after hour, was broken by these newcomers challenging round our bivouacs, crying their way to us like lost souls. And, peasant fashion, slobbering over our hands with protestations that we were their highest lords and they our deepest servants. Perhaps the reception of them fell short of our usual standard. But, in revenge, they were applying the torture of keeping us awake, uneasily awake. We had been at strain for 3 days and nights, thinking, ordering and executing. And now, on our road to rest, it was bitter to play away this 4th night also, at the old lackluster, dubious game of making friends. And their shaken morale impressed us worse and worse, till Nasir drew me aside and whispered that clearly there existed a focus of discontent in some centre near. I loosed out my peasant bodyguards to mix with the villagers and find the truth. And from their reports it seemed that the cause of distrust lay in the first settlement, at Taib, which had been shaken by the return of Joyce's armoured cars yesterday, by some chance incidents. And by a just fear that they were the spot most exposed in our retreat. I called Aziz, and we rode straight to Taib, over rough stretches of lava, trackless, and piled across with walls of broken stone. In the headman's hut sat the conclave which infected our visitors. They were debating whom to send to implore mercy from the Turks, when we walked in unannounced. Our single coming abashed them, in its assumption of supreme security. We talked irrelevantly an hour, of crops and farmyard prices, and drank some coffee, then rose to go. Behind us the babble broke out again. But now their inconstant spirits had veered to what seemed our stronger wind, and they sent no word to the enemy, though next day they were bombed and shelled for such stubborn complicity with us. We got back before dawn, and stretched out to sleep, when there came a loud boom from the railway, and a shell shattered beyond our sleeping host. The Turks had sent down an armoured train mounting a field gun. By myself I would have chanced its aim, for my sleep had been just long enough to make me rage for more, but the army had slept 6 hours and was moving. We hurried across the horrible going. An aeroplane came over, and circled round to help the gunners. Shells began to keep accurate pace with our line of march. We doubled our speed, and broke into a ragged procession of very open order. The directing aeroplane faltered suddenly, swerved aside towards the line, and seemed to land. The gun put in one more lucky shot, which killed 2 camels, but for the rest it lost accuracy, and after about 50 shots we drew out of range. It began to punish Taib. Joyce, at had been roused by the shooting, and came out to welcome us. Behind his tall figure the ruins were crested by a motley band, samples from every village and tribe in the Horan, come to do homage and offer at least lip service. To Nasir's tired disgust I left these to him, while I went off with Joyce and Winterton, telling them of the landed aeroplane, and suggesting that an armored car beat it up at home. Just then 2 more enemy machines appeared and landed in about the same place. However, breakfast, our first for some while, was getting ready. So we sat down and Joyce related how the men of Taib had fired at him as he passed by, presumably to show their opinion of strangers who stirred up a hornet's nest of Turks, and then hopped it. Breakfast ended. We called for a volunteer car to investigate the enemy aerodrome. Everybody came forward with a silent goodwill and readiness which caught me by the throat. Finally Joyce chose 2 cars, one for Junner and one for me, and we drove for 5 miles to the valley in whose mouth the planes had seemed to land. We silenced the cars and crept down its course. When about 2,000 yards from the railway, it bent round into a flat meadow, by whose further side stood 3 machines. This was magnificent, and we leaped forward, to meet a deep ditch with straight banks of cracking earth, quite impassable. We raced frantically along it, by a diagonal route, till we were within 1,200 yards. As we stopped 2 of the aeroplanes started. We opened fire, searching the range by dust spurts, but already they had run their distance and were off, swaying and clattering up across the sky over our heads. The 3rd engine was sulky. Its pilot and observer savagely pulled the propeller round, while we ranged nearer. Finally they leaped into the railway ditch as we put bullet after bullet into the fuselage till it danced under the rain. We fired 1,500 bullets at our target, they burned it in the afternoon, and then turned home. Unfortunately the 2 escaped machines had had time to go to Dira, and return, feeling spiteful. One was not clever and dropped his 4 bombs from a height, missing us widely. The other swooped low, placing 1 bomb each time with the utmost care. We crept on defenselessly, slowly, among the stones, feeling like sardines in a doomed tin, as the bombs fell closer. One sent a shower of small stuff through the driving slit of the car, but only cut our knuckles. One tore off a front tire and nearly lurched the car over. Of all danger give me the solitary sort. However we reached well and reported success to Joyce. We had proved to the Turks that aerodrome was not fit for use. And Dira lay equally open to car attack. Later I lay in the shadow of a car and slept, all the Arabs in the desert, and the Turkish aeroplanes which came and bombed us, having no effect upon my peace. In the clash of events men became feverishly tireless, but today we had finished our first round, fortunately, and it was necessary that I rest, to clear my mind about our next moves. As usual when I lay down I dropped asleep, and slept till afternoon. Strategically, our business was to hold on to which gave us command at will of Dira's 3 railways. If we held it another week we should strangle the Turkish armies, however little Allenby did. Yet tactically was a dangerous place. An inferior force composed exclusively of regulars, without a guerrilla screen, could not safely hold it, yet to that we should shortly be reduced, if our air helplessness continued patent. The Turks had at least 9 machines. We were camped 12 miles from their aerodrome, in the open desert, about the only possible water supply, with great herds of camels and many horses necessarily grazing round us. The Turks' beginning of bombing had been enough to disquiet the irregulars who were our eyes and ears. Soon they would break up and go home, and our usefulness be ended. Taib, too, that first village which covered us from Dira, it lay defenseless and quivering under repeated attack. If we were to remain in Taib must be content with us. Clearly our first duty was to get air reinforcement from Allenby, who had arranged to send a news machine to Azraq on the day after tomorrow. I judged it would be profitable for me to go across and talk with him. I could be back on the 22nd. Would hold out so long, for we might always fox the aeroplanes a while by moving to El Shurab, the next Roman village. Whether at Te or El Shurab, to be safe we must keep the initiative. The Dira side was temporarily closed by the suspicion of the peasants, there remained the Hijaz line. The bridge at kilometer 149 was nearly mended. We must smash it again, and smash another to the south, to deny the repair trains access to it. An effort by Winterton yesterday showed that the first was a matter for troops and guns. The second was objective for a raid. I went across to see if my bodyguard could do it with me on our way to Azraq. Something was wrong. They were red-eyed, hesitant, trembling. At last I understood that while I was away in the morning the Zaghi, Abdullah and their other chiefs had gone mercilessly through the tally of those who flinched at Nizib. It was their right, for since Tafili I had left its discipline to the company itself, but the effect for the moment was to make them useless for my purpose. Such punishment was preceded by fear, but the memory of its infliction provoked wilder lawlessness among the stronger victims, and a likelihood of crimes of violence among the witnesses. They would have been dangerous to me, to themselves, or to the enemy, as whim and opportunity provided, had we gone that night into action. So, instead, I suggested to Joyce that the Egyptians and Gurkhas return to Aqaba. Proposing further that he lend me an armored car to go down with them to the railway, their first stage, and do what could be done. We went up to Nasir and Nuri said, and told them I would be back on the 22nd with fighting machines, to deliver us from air scouts and bombing. Meanwhile we would salve Taib with money for the Turkish damage, and Joyce would make landing grounds, here and at El Shurab, against my return with our air reinforcements. The demolition of that night was a fantastic muddle. We moved at sunset to an open valley, 3 easy miles from the railway. Trouble might threaten from Mafraq station. My armored car, with Junner attendant in his Ford, would guard that side against hostile advance. The Egyptians would move direct to the line, and fire their charges. My guiding fell through. We wandered for 3 hours in a maze of valleys, not able to find the railway, nor the Egyptians, nor our starting point. At last we saw a light and drove for it, to find ourselves in front of Mafraq. We turned back to get into place, and heard the clank of an engine running northward out of the station. We chased its intermittent flame, hoping to catch it between us and the broken bridge, but before we overtook it there came flashes and explosions far up, as Peake fired his 30 charges. Some mounted men galloped headlong past us, southward. We fired at them, and then the patrolling train returned, backing at its best speed from Peake's danger. We ran alongside, and opened on the tracks with our Vickers, while Junner sent a green shower of tracer bullets from his Lewis across the dark. Above our shooting and the noise of the engine we heard the Turks howling with terror of this luminous attack. They fired back raggedly, but as they did so the big car suddenly sneezed and stood still. A bullet had pierced the unarmored end of the petrol tank, the only unarmored spot of all our team of cars. It took us an hour to plug the leak. Then we drove along the silent line to the twisted rails and gaping culverts, but could not find our friends. So we drew a mile back, and there at last I had my sleep out, 3 perfect hours of it before the dawn. I awoke fresh, and recognized our place. Probably it was only the 5th sleepless night which had made my wits woolly. We pushed forward, passing the Egyptians with the Gurkhas, and reached Azraq in the early afternoon. There were Faisal and Nuri Shah Alan, eager to hear our news. We explained particularly, and then I went over to Marshall, in the temporary hospital. He had all our badly wounded in his quiet care, but they were fewer than he had expected, so he was able to spare me a stretcher for my bed. At dawn Joyce unexpectedly arrived. He had made up his mind that in this lull it was his duty to go down to Aba el Lisan to help Zayd and Jaffer before Mon, and to press forward Hornby among the Beni Sakr. Then the plane from Palestine arrived, and we heard the amazing first chronicle of Allenby's victory. He had smashed and burst through and driven the Turks inconceivably. The face of our war was changed, and we gave hurried word of it to Faisal, with counsels of the general revolt to take profit of the situation. An hour later I was safely in Palestine. From Ramla the Air Force gave me a car up to headquarters. And there I found the great man unmoved, except for the light in his eye as Bowles bustled in every 15 minutes, with news of some wider success. Allenby had been so sure, before he started, that to him the result was almost boredom, but no general, however scientific, could see his intricate plan carried out over an enormous field in every particular with complete success. And not know an inward gladness, especially when he felt it, as he must have felt it, a reward of the breadth and judgment which made him conceive such unorthodox movements. And break up the proper book of his administrative services to suit them, and support them by every moral and material asset, military or political, within his grasp. He sketched to me his next intentions. Historic Palestine was his, and the broken Turks, in the hills, expected a slackening of the pursuit. Not at all. Bartholomew and Evans were prepared to provision 3 more thrusts, one across Jordan to Amman, to be done by Chaytor's New Zealanders, one across Jordan to Dira, to be done by Barrow and his Indians. One across Jordan to Quneitra, to be done by Chauvel's Australians. Chaytor would rest at Amman, Barrow and Chauvel on attaining the first objectives would converge on Damascus. We were to assist the 3, and I was not to carry out my saucy threat to take Damascus, till we were all together. I explained our prospects, and how everything was being wrecked by air impotence. He pressed a bell and in a few minutes Salmond and Borton were conferring with us. Their machines had taken an indispensable part in Allenby's scheme, the perfection of this man who could use infantry and cavalry, artillery and air force, navy and armored cars, deceptions and irregulars, each in its best fashion. And had fulfilled it. There were no more Turks in the sky, except on our side, as I hurriedly interpolated. So much the better, said Salmond, they would send 2 Bristol fighters over to Umtay to sit with us while we needed them. Had we spares? Petrol? Not a drop. How was it to be got there? Only by air. An air-contained fighting unit? Unheard of. However, Salmond and Borton were men avid of novelty. They worked out loads for D.H. G. and Handley Page, while Allenby sat by, listening and smiling, sure it would be done. The cooperation of the air with his unfolding scheme had been so ready and elastic, the liaison so complete and informed and quick. It was the RAF, which had converted the Turkish retreat into rout, which had abolished their telephone and telegraph connections, had blocked their lorry columns, scattered their infantry units. The air chiefs turned on me and asked if our landing grounds were good enough for a Handley Page with full load. I had seen the big machine once in its shed, but unhesitatingly said, yes, though they had better send an expert over with me in the Bristols tomorrow and make sure. He might be back by noon, and the Handley come at 3 o'clock. Salmond got up, that's all right, sir, we'll do the necessary. I went out and breakfasted. Allenby's headquarter was a perfect place, a cool, airy, whitewashed house, proofed against flies, and made musical by the moving of the wind in the trees outside. I felt immoral, enjoying white tablecloths, and coffee, and soldier servants, while our people at Umtay lay like lizards among the stones, eating unleavened bread, and waiting for the next plane to bomb them. I felt restless as the dusty sunlight which splashed a diaper over the paths, through chinks in the leaves. Because, after a long spell of the restrained desert, flowers and grass seemed to fidget, and the everywhere burgeoning green of tilth became vulgar, in its fecundity. However, Clayton and Deeds and Dawnay were friendliness itself, and also the Air Force staff, while the good cheer and conscious strength of the Commander-in-Chief was a bath of comfort to a weary person after long strained days. Bartholomew moved maps about, explaining what they would do. I added to his knowledge of the enemy, for I was his best-served intelligence officer, and in return his perspective showed me the victory sure, whatever happened to our strained little stop-block over there. Yet it seemed to me that in the Arab hands lay an option, whether to let this victory be just one more victory, or, by risking themselves once more, to make it final. Not that, so stated, it was a real option, but, when body and spirit were as wearily sick as mine, they almost instinctively sought a plausible avoidance of the way of danger. Chapter 114. Before dawn, on the Australian aerodrome, stood 2 Bristols and a DHG. In one was Ross Smith, my old pilot, who had been picked out to fly the new Handley Page, the single machine of its class in Egypt, the apple of Salmon's eye. His lending it to fly over the enemy line on so low an errand as baggage carrying, was a measure of the goodwill toward us. We reached Umtay in an hour, and saw that the army had gone, so I waved ourselves back to Ern el Shurab. And there they were, the defensive group of cars, and Arabs hiding from our suspect noise here, there and everywhere, the cute camels dispersed singly over the plain, filling themselves with the wonderful grazing. Young, when he saw our markings, put a landing signal and smoke bombs on the turf which his care and Nuri sets had swept clear of stones. Ross Smith anxiously paced the length and breadth of the prepared space, and studied its imperfections, but rejoined us, where the drivers were making breakfast, with a clear face. The ground was okay for the Handley Page. Young told us of repeated bombings yesterday and the day before, which had killed some regulars and some of Pisani's gunners and tired the life out of everyone, so that they moved in the night to el Shurab. The idiot Turks were still bombing Umtay, though men went to it only in the neutral noons and nights to draw water. Also I heard of Winterton's last blowing up of the railway, an amusing night, in which he had met an unknown soldier and explained to him in broken Arabic how well they were getting on. The soldier had thanked God for his mercies, and disappeared in the dark, whence a moment later, machine-gun fire opened from left and right. Nevertheless, Winterton had fired all his charges, and withdrawn in good order without loss. Nasir came to us, and reported this man hurt, and that killed, this clan getting ready, those already joined, but others gone home, all the gossip of the country. The 3 shining aeroplanes had much restored the Arabs, who lauded the British, and their own bravery and endurance, while I told them the scarce credible epic of Allenby's success, Nablus taken, Afuli taken, Baysan and Semak and Haifa. My hearers' minds drew after me like flames. Talal took fire, boasting, while the Ruala shouted for instant march upon Damascus. Even my bodyguard, still bearing witness of the Zaghi's severity in their muddy eyes and constrained faces, cheered up and began to preen a little before the crowd, with a dawn of happiness. A shiver of self-assertion and confidence ran across the camp. I determined to bring up Faisal and Nuri Shah Alan for the final effort. Meanwhile it was breakfast time with a smell of sausage in the air. We sat round, very ready, but the watcher on the broken tower yelled "Aeroplane up," seeing one coming over from Dira. Our Australians, scrambling wildly to their yet hot machines, started them in a moment. Ross Smith, with his observer, leaped into one, and climbed like a cat up the sky. After him went Peters, while the 3rd pilot stood beside the D.H.G. and looked hard at me. I seemed not to understand him. Lewis guns, scarf mountings, sights, rings which turned, vanes, knobs which rose and fell on swinging parallel bars, to shoot, one aimed with this side of the ring or with that, according to the varied speed and direction of oneself and the enemy. I had been told the theory, could repeat some of it, but it was in my head, and rules of action were only snares of action till they had run out of the empty head into the hands, by use. No, I was not going up to air fight, no matter what caste I lost with the pilot. He was an Australian, of a race delighting in additional risks, not an Arab to whose gallery I must play. He was too respectful to speak, only he looked reproach at me while we watched the battle in the air. There were 1 enemy 2-seater and 3 scouts. Ross Smith fastened on the big one, and, after 5 minutes of sharp machine gun rattle, the German dived suddenly towards the railway line. As it flashed behind the low ridge, there broke out a pennon of smoke, and from its falling place a soft, dark cloud. An "ah" came from the Arabs about us. 5 minutes later Ross Smith was back and jumped gaily out of his machine, swearing that the Arab front was the place. Our sausages were still hot. We ate them, and drank tea, our last English stores, broached for the visitors, but were hardly at the grapes from Jebel Druze when again the watchman tossed up his cloak and screamed, "A plane!" This time Peters won the race, Ross Smith second, with Trail, disconsolate, in reserve, but the shy enemy turned back so soon that Peters did not catch them till near Error. There he drove down his quarry, fighting. Later, when the wave of war rolled thither, we found the hopeless crash, and 2 charred German bodies. Ross Smith wished he might stay forever on this Arab front with an enemy every half hour, and deeply envied Peters his coming days. However, he must go back for the Handley Page with petrol, food and spares. The 3rd plane was for Azraq, to get the Observer marooned there yesterday, and I went in it so far, to see Faisal. Time became spacious to those who flew. We were in Azraq 30 hours after leaving it. Gurkhas and Egyptians I turned back to rejoin the army, for new demolitions in the north. Then, with Faisal and Nuri Shah Alan, I packed into the green Vauxhall, and off we went for El Shurab to see the Handley Page alight. We ran at speed over the smooth flint or mud flat, letting the strong car throb itself fully, but luck was hostile. A dispute was reported us, and we had to turn aside to a local Sarahin camp. However, we made profit of our loss, by ordering their fighting men to Umtay, and we had them send word of victory across the railway, that the roads through the Ajlan hills might be closed to the broken Turkish armies trying to escape into safety. Then our car flashed northward again. 20 miles short of El Shurab we perceived a single Bedoui, running southward all in a flutter, his grey hair and grey beard flying in the wind, and his shirt, tucked up in his belly cord, puffing out behind him. He altered course to pass near us, and, raising his bony arms, yelled, "The biggest aeroplane in the world," before he flapped on into the south, to spread his great news among the tents. At El Shurab the Handley stood majestic on the grass, with bristles and 9 data, like fledglings beneath its spread of wings. Round it admired the Arabs, saying, "Indeed and at last they have sent us the aeroplane, of which these things were foals." Before night rumor of Faisal's resource went over Jebel Druze and the hollow of Horan, telling people that the balance was weighted on our side. Borton himself had come over in the machine, to concert help. We talked with him while our men drew from her bomb racks and fuselage a ton of petrol, oil and spare parts for Bristol fighters, tea and sugar and rations for our men, letters, Reuter telegrams and medicines for us. Then the great machine rose into the early dusk, for Ramla, with an agreed program of night bombing against Dira and Mafraq, to complete that ruin of the railway traffic which our gun cotton had begun. We, for our share, would keep up the gun cotton pressure. Allenby had assigned us the Turkish Fourth Army, to harass and contain till Chaytor forced them out of Amman, and afterwards to cut up, on their retreat. This retreat was only an affair of days, and it was as certain as things could be in war that we should raise the plains between us and Damascus next week. So Faisal decided to add to our column Nuri Shahlan's Ruala camel men from Azraq. It would increase us to about 4,000 strong, more than 3/4 irregular, but reliably so, for Nuri, the hard, silent, cynical old man, held the tribe between his fingers like a tool. He was that rarity in the desert, a man without sense of argument. He would or would not, and there was no more to it. When others finished talking, he would announce his will in a few flat phrases, and wait calmly for obedience. Which came, for he was feared. He was old and wise, which meant tired and disappointed, so old that it was my abiding wonder he should link himself to our enthusiasm. I rested next day in Nasir's tent, among his peasant visitors, sorting out the too abundant news furnished by their quick wit and goodwill. During my rest day, Nuri said, with Pisani and 2 guns, Sterling, Winterton, Young, their armored cars, and a considerable force, went openly to the railway, cleared it by approved military means, destroyed a kilometre of rail, and burnt the tentative wooden structure with which the Turks were mending the bridge blown up by Joyce and myself before our first attack on Dira. Nuri Shah Alan, in black broadcloth cloak, personally led his Ruala horsemen, galloping with the best of them. Under his eye the tribe showed a valor which drew praise even from Nuri said. Chapter 115. Nun's operation of today was the Turks' final blow, after which they gave up trying to restore the line between Amman and Dira. We did not know this, but still had its bogey set over us, and were urgent to put out of action a yet longer stretch. Accordingly, next dawn, Winterton, Gemmell and I went out on cars to examine the lines south of Mafraq Station. We were received with machine gun fire of a vigor, direction and intensity beyond any of our experience. Later we captured the experts and found they were a German machine gun unit. For the moment we drew out, puzzled, and went further to a tempting bridge. My plan was to run under it in the car till the vault enabled us to lay the charge against the pier in shelter. So I transferred myself to an armored car, put 60 pounds of gun cotton on the backboard, and told the driver to push in under the arch. Winterton and Gemmell came behind in the supporting car. "It's very hot," groaned Gemmell. "It's going to be still hotter where we're going," replied Winterton, as we drew in slowly over indifferent ground with aimless shells falling about. We were picking our way forward, about 50 yards from the bank, with enough machine gun bullets for a week's fighting rattling off our armor, when someone from behind the line bowled a hand grenade at us. This new condition made impossible my plan of getting under the bridge. For one thing, a hit on the back of the car would have set off our gun cotton and blown us to blazes, for another, the car was helpless against a lobbed grenade. So we drew off, perplexed to understand this defense lavished on a bit of railway, and much interested, indeed amused, at worthy opposition after so long ease. In our imaginations, Czech was a short, compact, furious man, darting glances every way from beneath tangled eyebrows, for an end to his troubles. Beside him victory seemed a lanky, white-skinned, rather languid woman. We must try again after dark. At El Shurab we found that Nasir wished to fix camp once more at Umtay. It was a first stage of our journey to Damascus, so his wish delighted me, and we moved, winning thereby good excuse for doing nothing this night to the line. Instead, we sat and told stories of experience and waited for midnight, when the Handley page was to bomb Mafraq Station. It came, and 100-pound bomb after 100-pound bomb crashed into the packed sidings till they caught fire, and the Turks' shooting stopped. We slept, having given prize of the night to a tale of Enver Pasha, after the Turks retook Sharqi. He went to see it, in a penny steamer, with Prince Gemmell and a gorgeous staff. The Bulgars, when they came, had massacred the Turks. As they retired the Bulgar peasants went too. So the Turks found hardly anyone to kill. A greybeard was led on board for the commander-in-chief to bait. At last Enver tired of this. He signed to 2 of his bravo aides, and throwing open the furnace door, said, "Tush him in." The old man screamed, but the officers were stronger and the door was slammed to on his jerking body. We turned, feeling sick, to go away, but Enver, his head on one side, listening, halted us. So we listened, till there came a crash within the furnace. He smiled and nodded, saying, "Their heads always pop, like that." All night, and next day, the fire among the trucks burned greater and greater. It was proof of the breakdown of the Turks, which the Arabs had been rumoring since yesterday. They said the Fourth Army was streaming up from Amman in a loose mob. The Beni Hassan, who were cutting off stragglers and weak detachments, compared them to gypsies on the march. We held a council. Our work against the Fourth Army was finished. Such remnants as avoided out of the hands of the Arabs would reach Dera as unarmed stragglers. Our new endeavor should be to force the quick evacuation of Dera, in order to prevent the Turks there reforming the fugitives into a rear guard. So I proposed that we march north, past Tel Er, and over the railway at dawn tomorrow, into Sheikh Saad village. It lay in familiar country with abundant water, perfect observation, and a secure retreat west or north, or even southwest, if we were directly attacked. It cut off Dera from Damascus, and Mesrib also. Talal seconded me with fervor. Nuri Shah Alam gave his nod, Nasir and Nuri said. So we prepared to strike camp. The armored cars could not come with us. They had better stay in Azraq, till Dera fell, and we wanted them to help us into Damascus. The Bristol fighters, likewise, had done their work, clearing the air of Turkish aeroplanes. They might return to Palestine with news of our move to Sheikh Saad. Off they circled. We, watching their line of flight, noticed a great cloud of dust added to the slow smoke from ruined Mafraq. One machine turned back and dropped a scribble that a large body of hostile cavalry were heading out from the railway towards us. This was unwelcome news, for we were not in trim for a fight. The cars had gone, the aeroplanes had gone, one company of the mounted infantry had marched, Pisani's mules were packed and drawn up in column. I went off to Nuri said, standing with Nasir on an ash heap at the head of the hill, and we wavered whether to run or stand. At last it seemed wiser to run, since Sheikh Saad was a more profitable stop-block. So we hurried the regulars away. Yet things could hardly be left like that. Accordingly Nuri Shah Alan and Taulal led the Ruala horse and the Horan horse back to delay the pursuit. They had an unexpected ally, for our cars, on their way to Azraq, had seen the enemy. After all, the Turks were not cavalry coming to attack us, but deluded elements seeking a shorter way home. We took some hundreds of thirsty prisoners and much transport, causing such panic that the main route in the plain cut the traces of their limbers and rode off on the bare horses. The infection of terror spread down the line, and troops miles from any Arab interference threw away all they had, even to their rifles, and made a mad rush toward supposed safety in Dira. However, this interruption delayed us. For we could hardly march a khaki-clad body of regular camel corps across Horan at night without enough local cavalry to go bail to the suspicious villagers that we were not Turks. So late in the afternoon we halted for Taulal and Nasir and Nuri Shah Alan to catch up. This halt gave some people time to review the proceedings, and new questions arose as to the wisdom of crossing the railway again, to put ourselves in the dangerous position of Sheikh Saad, astride the retreat of the main Turkish forces. Finally, near midnight, Sabin appeared where I lay awake in the midst of the army on my carpet. He suggested that we had done enough. Allenby had appointed us watchmen of the Fourth Army. We had just seen its disordered flight. Our duty was completed, and we might honorably fall back to Basra, 20 miles out of the way to the east, where the Druzes were collecting under Nezabel Bekri to help us. We might wait with them for the British to take Dira, and for our reward, in the victorious close of the campaign. This attitude passed me by, since, if we withdrew to Jebel Druz, we ended our active service before the game was won, leaving the last brunt on Allenby. I was very jealous for the Arab honor, in whose service I would go forward at all costs. They had joined the war to win freedom, and the recovery of their old capital by force of their own arms was the sign they would best understand. Duty, like people who praised it, was a poor thing. Evidently, by thrusting behind Dira into Sheikh Saad we put more pressure on the Turks than any British unit was in place to put. It would forbid the Turks fighting again this side of Damascus, for which gain our few lives would be cheap payment. Damascus meant the end of this war in the east, and, I believed, the end of the general war, too, because the Central Powers being interdependent, the breaking of their weakest link, Turkey, would swing the whole cluster loose. Therefore, for every sensible reason, strategical, tactical, political, even moral, we were going on. Sabin's stubborn resistant mind was not to be convinced. He returned with Pisanine Winterton, and began to debate. Speaking slowly because Nuri said was lying on the next rug only half asleep, and he wanted to include him in the conference. Accordingly he stressed the military aspect, our fulfilled purpose and the danger of the Hijaz Railway. This delay made us too late to cross tonight. Tomorrow it would be madness to attempt the operation. The line would be guarded from end to end by tens of thousands of Turks pouring out of Dira. If they let us over we would only be in still greater danger. Joyce, he said, had appointed him military advisor to the expedition, and it was his duty to point out, reluctantly, that as a regular officer he knew his business. Had I been a regular officer I might have found Sabin's upsetting the others irregular. As it was I endured his complaints, patiently sighing whenever I thought it would irritate the Protestant. At the end wanderingly I said I wanted to sleep, since we would have to be up early to cross the line, and it was my intention to go in front with my bodyguard among the Bedouin, wherever they were. For it was odd that Nuri Shah Alan and Taulal had not overtaken us. Anyway, I was going to sleep now. Pisani, whose long military life had been all as subordinate, said with correctness that he took his orders and would follow. I liked him for that, and tried to soothe his honest doubts by reminding him that we had worked for 18 months together without his ever finding cause to call me rash. He replied with a French laugh that he thought it all very rash, but was a soldier. Winterton's instinct joined him to the weaker and more sporting side in any choice but fox hunting. Nuri said had lain silently through our talk, pretending to be asleep, but, when Sabin went away, he rolled over whispering, "Is it true?" I replied that I saw no unusual risk in crossing the line in mid-afternoon, and with care we should avoid traps at Sheikh Saad. He lay back satisfied. Chapter 116. Nasir, Nuri Shah Alan and Talal had overshot us in the dark. Our joined forces marched, with a heady breeze in the teeth, northward across the Ploughland's fat, happy villages. Over the harvested fields, whose straw had been rather plucked than reaped, grew thistles, tall as a child, but now yellow and dried and dead. The wind snapped them off at the hollow root, and pitch pulled their branchy tops along the level ground, thistle blowing against thistle and interlocking spines, till in huge balls they careered like runaway haycocks across the fallow. Arab women, out with their donkeys to fetch water, ran to us, crying that an aeroplane had landed a while since, nearby. It bore the round rings of the Sherifian camel brand upon its body. Peake rode across, to find 2 Australians whose Bristol had been hit in the radiator, over Dira. They were glad, though astonished, to meet friends. After the leak had been plugged, we levied water from the women, to fill them up, and they flew home safely. Men rode up every minute and joined us, while from each village the adventurous young ran out afoot to enter our ranks. As we moved on, so closely knit in the golden sunlight, we were able, in rare chance, to see ourselves as a whole. Quickly we became a character, an organism, in whose pride each of us was uplifted. We cracked bawdy jokes to set off the encompassing beauty. At noon we entered watermelon fields. The army ran upon them, while we spied out the line, which lay desertedly quivering in the sunlight ahead. As we watched a train pass down. Only last night had the railway been mended, and this was the 3rd train. We moved without opposition upon the line in a horde 2 miles across, and began hastily to blow up things, anyone who had explosive using it as he fancied. Our hundreds of novices were full of zeal, and the demolitions, albeit uninstructed, were wide. Clearly our return had surprised the dazed enemy. We must extend and improve this chance. So we went to Nuri Shah Alan, Auda, and Talal, and asked what local effort each would undertake. Talal, the energetic, would attack Ezra, the big grain depot to the north. Auda was for Khirbet el Ghazala, the corresponding station southward. Nuri would sweep his men down the main road, towards Dira, on chance of Turkish parties. These were 3 good ideas. The chiefs went to put them into being, while we, pulling our column to its shape again, pursued our road past the ruined colony of Sheikh Miskin, very gaunt in the moonlight. Its obstacle of water ditches muddled our thousands, so that we halted on the stubble plain beyond, 'fore dawn. Some made fires against the penetrating mist of this clay horn, others slept as they were on the dew-slimy ground. Lost men went about calling their friends, in that sharp, full-throated wail of the Arab villager. The moon had set, and the world was black and very cold. I roused my bodyguard, who rode so briskly that we entered Sheikh Saad with the dawn. As we passed between the rocks into the field behind the trees, the earth sprang to life again with the new sun. The morning airs flashed the olive yards to silver, and men from a great goat-hair tent on the right called us to guest with them. We asked whose camp it was. Ibn Smair's, they replied. This threatened complications. Rashid was an enemy of Nuri Shahlan's, unreconciled, chance met. At once we sent a warning to Nasir. Fortunately Ibn Smair was absent. So his family would be our temporary guests, and Nuri, as host, must observe the rules. It was a relief, for already in our ranks we had hundreds of deadly enemies, their feuds barely suspended by Faisal's peace. The strain of keeping them in play, and employing their hotheads in separate spheres, balancing opportunity and service that our direction might be esteemed as above jealousy, all that was evil enough. Conduct of the war in France would have been harder if each division, almost each brigade, of our army had hated every other with a deadly hatred and fought when they met suddenly. However, we had kept them quiet for 2 years, and it would be only a few days now. The parties of the night returned, full of spoil. Ezra had been feebly held by Abd el-Kader, the Algerian, with his retainers, some volunteers and troops. When Talal came, the volunteers joined him, the troops fled, and the retainers were so few that Abd el-Kader had to abandon the place without fighting. Our men were too heavy with their great booty to catch him. Audha came, boasting. He had taken El Ghazal by storm, capturing a derelict train, guns and 200 men, of whom some were Germans. Nuri Shah Alan reported 400 prisoners with mules and machine guns. The rank and file of Turks had been farmed out to remote villages, to earn their keep. An English aeroplane flew round and round, wondering if we were the Arab force. Young spread out ground signals, and to him they dropped a message that Bulgaria had surrendered to the Allies. We had not known there was an offensive in the Balkans, so the news came orphaned, and as it were insignificant to us. Undoubtedly the end, not only of the Great War, but of our war, was near. A sharp effort, and our trial would be over and everyone loosed back to his affairs, forgetting the madness, since for most of us it was the first war, and we looked to its end as rest and peace. The army had arrived. The groves became thronged as each detachment picked out the best vacant place and unsaddled, whether beside fig trees, or under palms, or olives, from which the birds burst out in frightened clouds, with a multitudinous crying. Our men took their animals to the stream meandering through green bushes and flowers and cultivated fruits, things strange to us during the years of our wandering in the flinty desert. The people of Sheikh Saad came shyly to look at Faisal's army, which had been a whispered legendary thing, and was now in their village, led by renowned or formidable names, Talal, Nasir, Nuri, Suda. We stared back, in secret envy of their peasant life. While the men stretched the saddle stiffness of riding from thin legs, we went up, 5 or 6 of us, above the ruins, whence across the southern plain we should see the measure of security in store for us. To our astonishment we perceived, just over the walls, a thin company of regulars in uniform, Turks, Austrians, Germans, with 8 machine guns on pack animals. They were toiling up from Galilee towards Damascus after their defeat by Allenby. Hopeless, but carefree, marching at ease, thinking themselves 50 miles from any war. We did not give an alarm, to spare our tired troops pains, just Durzi ibn Dugmi, with the Kafaji and others of the family, mounted quietly and fell on them from a narrow lane. The officers showed fight and were instantly killed. The men threw down their arms, and in 5 minutes had been searched and robbed and were being shepherded in file along the water paths between the gardens to an open pound which seemed fit for our prison. Sheikh Saad was paying soon and well. Away to the east appeared 3 or 4 black knots of people, moving northward. We loosed the hawatat on them, and after an hour they returned in laughter, each man leading a mule or pack-horse. Poor, tired, galled brutes, showing all too clearly the straits of the beaten army. The riders had been unarmed soldiers fleeing from the British. The hawatat disdained to make such prisoners. We gave them to the boys and girls of the villages for servants, sneered Zal, with his thin-lipped smile. News came to us from the west that small companies of Turks were retiring into the local villages from Chauvel's attacks. We sent against them armed parties of Nairn, a peasant tribe which had joined us last night at Sheikh Miskin, as appointed by Nasir, to do what they could. The mass rising we had so long prepared was now in flood, rising higher as each success armed more rebels. In 2 days' time we might have 60,000 armed men in movement. We snapped up further trifles on the Damascus road. And then saw heavy smoke above the hill which hid Dira. A man cantered in, to inform Talal that the Germans had set fire to aeroplanes and storehouses, and stood ready to evacuate the town. A British plane dropped word that Barrow's troops were near Remda, and that 2 Turkish columns, one of 4,000, one of 2,000, were retiring towards us from Dira and Mezrib respectively. It seemed to me that these 6,000 men were all that remained of the 4th army, from Dira, and of the 7th army, which had been disputing Barrow's advance. With their destruction would end our purpose here. Yet, till we knew, we must retain Sheikh Saad. So the larger column, the 4,000, we would let pass, only fastening to them Khalid and his Ruala, with some northern peasantry, to harry their flanks and rear. Chapter 117. The nearer 2,000 seemed more our size. We would meet them with half our regulars, and 2 of Pisani's guns. Talal was anxious, for their indicated route would bring them through Tafis, his own village. He determined us to make speed there and seize the ridge south of it. Unfortunately, speed was only a relative term with men so tired. I rode with my troop to Tafis, hoping to occupy a shadow position beyond it and fight a retiring action till the rest came up. Halfway on the road, there met us mounted Arabs, herding a drove of stripped prisoners towards Sheikh Saad. They were driving them mercilessly, the bruises of their urging blew across the ivory backs. But I left them to it, for these were Turks of the police battalion of Dira, beneath whose iniquities the peasant faces of the neighborhood had run with tears and blood, innumerable times. The Arabs told us that the Turkish column, Jemal Pasha's Lancer regiment, was already entering Tafis. When we got within sight, we found they had taken a village, from which sounded an occasional shot, and were halted about it. Small pyres of smoke were going up from between the houses. On the rising ground to this side, knee-deep in the thistles, stood a remnant of old men, women and children, telling terrible stories of what had happened when the Turks rushed in an hour before. We lay on watch, and saw the enemy force march away from their assembly ground behind the houses. They headed in good order towards Miskin, the lancers in front and rear, composite formations of infantry disposed in column with machine gun support as flank guards, guns and a mass of transport in the center. We opened fire on the head of their line when it showed itself beyond the houses. They turned 2 field guns upon us, for reply. The shrapnel was as usual overfused, and passed safely above our heads. Nuri came with Pisani. Before their ranks rode Atta Abu Tay, expectant, and Taulal, nearly frantic with the tales his people poured out of the sufferings of the village. The last Turks were now quitting it. We slipped down behind them to end Talal's suspense, while our infantry took position and fired strongly with the Hotchkiss. Pisani advanced his half-battery among them, so that the French high explosive threw the rear guard into confusion. The village lay stilly under its slow wreaths of white smoke, as we rode near, on our guard. Some grey heaps seemed to hide in the long grass, embracing the ground in the close way of corpses. We looked away from these, knowing they were dead. But from one a little figure tottered off, as if to escape us. It was a child, 3 or 4 years old, whose dirty smock was stained red over one shoulder and side, with blood from a large half-fibrous wound, perhaps a lance thrust, just where neck and body joined. The child ran a few steps, then stood and cried to us in a tone of astonishing strength, all else being very silent, "Don't hit me, Baba." Abd el-Aziz, choking out something, this was his village, and she might be of his family, flung himself off his camel, and stumbled, kneeling, in the grass beside the child. His suddenness frightened her, for she threw up her arms and tried to scream, but, instead, dropped in a little heap, while the blood rushed out again over her clothes. Then, I think, she died. We rode past the other bodies of men and women and 4 more dead babies, looking very soiled in the daylight, towards the village, whose loneliness we now knew meant death and horror. By the outskirts were low mud walls, sheepfolds, and on one something red and white. I looked close and saw the body of a woman folded across it, bottom upwards, nailed there by a saw bayonet whose haft stuck hideously into the air from between her naked legs. She had been pregnant, and about her lay others, perhaps 20 in all, variously killed, but set out in accord with an obscene taste. The Zaghi burst into wild peals of laughter, the more desolate for the warm sunshine and clear air of this upland afternoon. I said, "The best of you brings me the most Turkish dead," and we turned after the fading enemy, on our way shooting down those who had fallen out by the roadside and came imploring our pity. One wounded Turk, half naked, not able to stand, sat and wept to us. Abdullah turned away his camel's head, but the Zaghi, with curses, crossed his track and whipped 3 bullets from his automatic through the man's bare chest. The blood came out with his heart beats, throb, 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 slower and slower. Talal had seen what we had seen. He gave one moan like a hurt animal. Then rode to the upper ground and sat there a while on his mare, shivering and looking fixedly after the Turks. I moved near to speak to him, but Audda caught my rein and stayed me. Very slowly Talal drew his headcloth about his face. And then he seemed suddenly to take hold of himself, for he dashed his stirrups into the mare's flanks and galloped headlong, bending low and swaying in the saddle, right at the main body of the enemy. It was a long ride down a gentle slope and across a hollow. We sat there like stone while he rushed forward, the drumming of his hoofs unnaturally loud in our ears, for we had stopped shooting, and the Turks had stopped. Both armies waited for him. And he rocked on in the hushed evening till only a few lengths from the enemy. Then he sat up in the saddle and cried his war cry, Talal, Talal, twice in a tremendous shout. Instantly their rifles and machine guns crashed out, and he and his mare, riddled through and through with bullets, fell dead among the lance points. Audda looked very cold and grim. God give him mercy, we will take his price. He shook his rein and moved slowly after the enemy. We called up the peasants, now drunk with fear and blood, and sent them from this side and that against the retreating column. The old lion of battle waked in Audda's heart, and made him again our natural, inevitable leader. By a skillful turn he drove the Turks into bad ground and split their formation into 3 parts. The third part, the smallest, was mostly made up of German and Austrian machine gunners grouped round 3 motor cars, and a handful of mounted officers or troopers. They fought magnificently and repulsed us time and again despite our hardiness. The Arabs were fighting like devils, the sweat blurring their eyes, dust parching their throats, while the flame of cruelty and revenge which was burning in their bodies so twisted them, that their hands could hardly shoot. By my order we took no prisoners, for the only time in our war. At last we left this stern section behind, and pursued the faster 2. They were in panic. And by sunset we had destroyed all but the smallest pieces of them, gaining as and by what they lost. Parties of peasants flowed in on our advance. At first there were 5 or 6 to a weapon, then one would win a bayonet, another a sword, a third a pistol. An hour later those who had been on foot would be on donkeys. Afterwards every man had a rifle, and a captured horse. By nightfall the horses were laden, and the rich plain was scattered over with dead men and animals. In a madness born of the horror of Tafis we killed and killed, even blowing in the heads of the fallen and of the animals. As though their death and running blood could slake our agony. Just one group of Arabs, who had not heard our news, took prisoner the last 200 men of the central section. Their respite was short. I had gone up to learn why it was, not unwilling that this remnant be let live as witnesses of Talal's price, but a man on the ground behind them screamed something to the Arabs, who with pale faces led me across to see. It was one of us, his thigh shattered. The blood had rushed out over the red soil, and left him dying, but even so he had not been spared. In the fashion of today's battle he had been further tormented by bayonets hammered through his shoulder and other leg into the ground, pinning him out like a collected insect. He was fully conscious. When we said, "Klassen, who did it?" he drooped his eyes towards the prisoners, huddling together so hopelessly broken. They said nothing in the moments before we opened fire. At last their heap ceased moving, and Hassan was dead. And we mounted again and rode home slowly. Home was my carpet 3 or 4 hours from us at Sheikh Saad, in the gloom, which felt so chill now that the sun had gone down. However, what with wounds and aches and weariness I could not rest from thinking of Talal, the splendid leader, the fine horseman, the courteous and strong companion of the road. And after a while I had my other camel brought, and with one of my bodyguard rode out into the night to join our men hunting the greater Dira column. It was very dark, with a wind beating in great gusts from the south and east. And only by the noise of shots it tossed across to us and by occasional gun flashes, did we at length come to the fighting. Every field and valley had its Turks stumbling blindly northward. Our men were clinging on. The fall of night had made them bolder, and they were now closing with the enemy. Each village, as the fight rolled to it, took up the work. And the black, icy wind was wild with rifle fire, shoutings, volleys from the Turks, and the rush of gallops, as small parties of either side crashed frantically together. The enemy had tried to halt and camp at sunset, but Khalid had shaken them again into movement. Some marched, some stayed. Many dropped asleep in their tracks with fatigue. They had lost order and coherence, and were drifting through the blast in lorn packets, ready to shoot and run at every contact with us or with each other, and the Arabs were as scattered, and nearly as uncertain. Exceptions were the German detachments, and here, for the first time, I grew proud of the enemy who had killed my brothers. They were 2,000 miles from home, without hope and without guides, in conditions mad enough to break the bravest nerves. Yet their sections held together, in firm rank, shearing through the rack of Turk and Arab like armored ships, high-faced and silent. When attacked they halted, took position, fired to order. There was no haste, no crying, no hesitation. They were glorious. At last I found Khalid, and asked him to call off the Ruala and leave this route to time and the peasantry. Heavier work, perhaps, lay to the southward. At dusk a rumor had passed across our plain that Dira was empty, and Trad, Khalid's brother, with a good half of the Anazay, had ridden off to sea. I feared a reverse for him, since there must still be Turks in the place, and more struggling towards it up the railway and through the Urbid hills. Indeed, unless Barrow, last reported to us as delayed in Remda, had lost contact with his enemy, there must be a fighting rearguard yet to follow. I wanted Khalid to support his brother. After an hour or two of shouting his message down the wind, hundreds of horsemen and camel men had rallied to him. On his way to Dira he charged through and over several detachments of Turks in the Starblink, and arrived to find Trad in secure possession. He had won through in the later twilight, taking the station at a gallop, jumping trenches and blotting out the scanty Turkish elements which still tried to resist. With local help the Ruala plundered the camp, especially finding booty in the fiercely burning storehouses whose flaming roofs imperiled their lives. But this was one of the nights in which mankind went crazy, when death seemed impossible, however many died to the right and left, and when others' lives became toys to break and throw away. Sheikh Saad passed a troubled evening of alarms and shots and shouts, with threatenings from the peasantry to murder the prisoners as added price of Taulal and his village. The active sheiks were out hunting the Turks, and their absence with their retainers deprived the Arab camp of its experienced chiefs and of its eyes and ears. Sleeping clan jealousies had awaked in the bloodthirst of the afternoon of killing, and Nasir and Nuri said, Young and Winterton had to strain every nerve in keeping peace. I got in after midnight and found Trad's messengers just arrived from Dira. Nasir left to join him. I had wished to sleep, for this was my 4th night of riding. But my mind would not let me feel how tired my body was, so about 2 in the morning I mounted a 3rd camel and splashed out towards Dira, down the Tafas track again, to windward of the dark village. Nuri said and his staff were riding the same road in advance of their mounted infantry, and our parties hurried together till the half-light came. Then my impatience and the cold would not let me travel horse-pace any longer. I gave liberty to my camel, the grand, rebellious Baha, and she stretched herself out against the field, racing my wearied followers for mile upon mile with piston strides like an engine, so that I entered Dira quite alone in the full dawn. Nasir was at the mayor's house, arranging a military governor, and police, and for an inquisition of the place, I supplemented his ideas, putting guards over the pumps and engine sheds and what remained of tool shops or stores. Then in an hour of talk I built up publicly a program of what the situation would demand of them, if they were not to lose hold. Poor Nasir stared in bewilderment. I inquired about General Barrow. A man just ridden in from the west told us he had been fired on by the English, as they deployed to attack the town. To prevent such an accident the Zaghi and I rode up the Buwabe, on whose crest was visible a strong post of Indian machine gunners. They trained their weapons on us, proud of such splendidly dressed prizes. However, an officer showed himself, with some British troopers, and to them I explained myself. They were indeed in the midst of an enveloping movement against Dera, and, while we watched, their aeroplanes bombed the luckless Nuri said as he rode into the railway station. This was his penalty for losing the race from Sheikh Saad, but, to stop it, I hurried down to where General Barrow was inspecting outposts in a car. I told him we had spent the night in the town, and the shooting he heard was joy-firing. He was short with me, but I had little pity for him, because he had delayed a day and night watering at the poor wells of Remda, though his map showed the lake and river of Mesrib in front, on the road by which the enemy were escaping. However, his orders were Dera, and to Dera he would go. He told me to ride beside him, but his horses hated my camel, so the general's staff bucked along the ditch, while I soberly paced the crown of the road. He said he must post sentries in the village to keep the populace in order. I explained gently that the Arabs had installed their military governor. At the wells he said his sappers must inspect the pumps. I replied welcoming their assistance. We had lit the furnaces and hoped to begin watering his horses in an hour. He snorted that we seemed to be at home, he would take charge only of the railway station. I pointed to the engine moving out towards Mesrib, where our little sheikh had prevented the Turks from blowing up the Tel el-Shahab bridge. Now become Arab property, and asked that his sentries be instructed not to interfere with our proper working of the line. He had had no orders as to the status of the Arabs. Clayton did us this service, thinking we should deserve what we could assert, so Barrow, who had come in thinking of them as a conquered people, though dazed at my calm assumption that he was my guest, had no option but to follow the lead of such assurance. My head was working full speed in these minutes, on our joint behalf, to prevent the fatal first steps by which the unimaginative British, with the best will in the world, usually deprived the acquiescent native of the discipline of responsibility, and created a situation which called for years of agitation and successive reforms and riotings to mend. I had studied Barrow and was ready for him. Years before, he had published his confession of faith in fear as the common people's main incentive to action in war and peace. Now I found fear a mean, overrated motive. No deterrent, and, though a stimulant, a poisonous stimulant, whose every injection served to consume more of the system to which it was applied. I could have no alliance with his pedant belief of scaring men into heaven, better that Barrow and I part at once. My instinct with the inevitable was to provoke it. Therefore, I was very spiny and high. Barrow surrendered himself by asking me to find him forage and foodstuffs. Indeed, soon we got on well. In the square I showed him Nasir's little silk pennon, propped on the balcony of the charred government office, with a yawning sentry underneath. Barrow drew himself up and saluted sharply, while a thrill of pleasure at the general's compliment ran round Arab officers and men. In return we strove to keep self-assertion within the bounds of political necessity. On all Arabs we impressed that these Indian troops were guests, and must be permitted, nay helped, to do anything they wished. The doctrine took us into unexpected places. Every chicken disappeared from the village, and 3 sowars carried off Nasir's pennon, having coveted the silver knobs and spike of its dainty staff. This pointed a contrast between the English general who saluted and the Indian trooper who stole, a contrast welcome to the Arab race, hesitation towards the Indians. Meanwhile, everywhere we were taking men and guns. Our prisoners could be counted in thousands. Some we handed over to the British, who counted them again, most we boarded out in the villages. Azrak heard the full news of victory. Faisal drove in a day later, our string of armored cars following his Vauxhall. He installed himself in the station. I called with my record of stewardship, as the tale ended the room shook with a gentle earthquake. Chapter 118. Barrow, now watered and fed, was due to leave for his meeting with Chauvel near Damascus, that they might enter the city together. He asked us to take the right flank, which suited me, for there, along the Hejaz line, was Nasir, hanging on to the main Turkish retreat, reducing its numbers by continuous attack day and night. I had still much to do, and therefore waited in Dera another night, savoring its quiet after the troops had gone, for the station stood at the limit of the open country, and the Indians round it had angered me by their out-of-placeness. The essence of the desert was the lonely moving individual, the son of the road, apart from the world as in a grave. These troops, in flocks like slow sheep, looked not worthy of the privilege of space. My mind felt in the Indian rank and file something puny and confined, an air of thinking themselves mean, almost a careful, esteemed subservience, unlike the abrupt wholesomeness of Bedouin. The manner of the British officers toward their men struck horror into my bodyguard, who had never seen personal inequality before. I had felt man's iniquity here, and so hated Dera that I lay each night with my men upon the old aerodrome. By the charred hangars my guards, fickle-surfaced as the sea, squabbled after their wont, and there tonight for the last time Abdullah brought me cooked rice in the silver bowl. After supping, I tried in the blankness to think forward, but my mind was a blank, my dreams puffed out like candles by the strong wind of success. In front was our too tangible goal, but behind lay the effort of 2 years, its misery forgotten or glorified. Names rang through my head, each in imagination a superlative: Rum the magnificent, brilliant Petra, Azrak the remote, Butra the very clean. Yet the men had changed. Death had taken the gentle ones. And the new stridency, of those who were left, hurt me. Sleep would not come, so before the light, I woke Sterling and my drivers, and we four climbed into the blue mist, our bowls tender, and set out for Damascus, along the dirt road which was first rutted, and then blocked by the transport columns and rearguard of Barrow's division. We cut across country to the French railway, whose old ballast gave us a clear, if rugged, road, then we put on speed. At noon we saw Barrow's pennon at a stream, where he was watering his horses. My bodyguard were nearby, so I took my camel and rode over to him. Like other confirmed horsemen, he had been a little contemptuous of the camel, and had suggested, in Dera, that we might hardly keep up with his cavalry, which was going to Damascus in about 3 forced marches. So when he saw me freshly riding up he was astonished, and asked when we left Dera. "This morning." His face fell. "Where will you stop tonight?" "In Damascus," said I gaily, and rode on, having made another enemy. It a little smote me to play tricks, for he was generous towards my wishes, but the stakes were high, beyond his sight, and I cared nothing what he thought of me, so that we won. I returned to Stirling, and drove on. At each village we left notes for the British advance guards, telling them where we were, and how far beyond us the enemy. It irked Stirling and myself to see the caution of Barrow's advance. Scouts scouting empty valleys, sections crowning every deserted hill, a screen drawn forward so carefully over friendly country. It marked the difference between our certain movements and the tentative processes of normal war. There could be no crisis till Kiswi, where we were to meet Chauvel, and where the Hejaz line approached our road. Upon the railway were Nasir, Nuri Shah Alan and Ada, with the tribes. Still harrying that column of 4,000, but in truth nearer 7, marked by our aeroplane near Sheikh Saad 3 busy days ago. They had fought ceaselessly throughout this time of our ease. As we drove up we heard firing, and saw shrapnel behind a ridge to our right, where the railway was. Soon appeared the head of a Turkish column of about 2,000 men, in ragged groups, halting now and then to fire their mountain guns. We ran on to overtake their pursuers, our great rolls very blue on the open road. Some Arab horsemen from behind the Turks galloped towards us, bucketing unhandily across the irrigation ditches. We recognized Nasir on his liver-colored stallion, the splendid animal yet spirited after its 100 miles of a running fight, also old Nuri Shah Alan and about 30 of their servants. They told us these few were all that remained of the 7,000 Turks. The Ruala were hanging desperately on to both flanks, while Ada Abu Tay had ridden behind Jebel Mania to gather the Wood Ali, his friends, and lie in wait there for this column, which they hoped to drive over the hill into his ambush. Did our appearance mean help at last? I told them the British, in force, were just behind. If they could delay the enemy only an hour. Nasir looked ahead and saw a walled and wooded farmstead barring the level. He called to Nuri Shah Alan, and they hastened thither to check the Turks. We drove back 3 miles to the leading Indians, and told their ancient, surly colonel what a gift the Arabs brought. He seemed not pleased to upset the beautiful order of his march, but at last opened out a squadron and sent them slowly across the plain towards the Turks, who turned the little guns their way. 1 or 2 shells burst nearly among the files, and then to our horror, for Nasir had put himself in jeopardy, expecting courageous help, the colonel ordered a retirement, and fell back quickly to the road. Sterling and myself, hopping mad, dashed down and begged him not to be afraid of mountain guns, no heavier than very pistols, but neither to kindness nor to wrath did the old man budge an inch. We raced a 3rd time back along the road in search of higher authority. A red-tipped aide told us that over there was General Gregory. We blessed him, Sterling's professional pride nearly in tears at the mismanagement. We pulled our friend aboard and found his general, to whom we lent our car that the brigade major might take hot orders to the cavalry. A galloper hurtled back for the horse artillery, which opened fire just as the last of the light fled up the hill to its summit and took refuge in the clouds. Middlesex yeomanry appeared and were pushed in among the Arabs, to charge the Turkish rear. And, as the night fell, we saw the break-up of the enemy, who abandoned their guns, their transport and all their stuff and went streaming up the col towards the 2 peaks of Mania, escaping into what they thought was empty land beyond. However, in the empty land was Auda, and in that night of his last battle the old man killed and killed, plundered and captured, till dawn showed him the end. There passed the 4th Army, our stumbling block for 2 years. Gregory's happy vigor heartened us to face Nasir. We drove to Kiswi, where we had agreed to meet him before midnight. After us came the press of Indian troops. We sought a retired spot, but already there were men by the thousand everywhere. The movement and cross-currents of so many crowded minds drove me about, restlessly, like themselves. In the night my color was unseen. I could walk as I pleased, an unconsidered Arab, and this finding myself among, but cut off from, my own kin made me strangely alone. Our armored car men were persons to me, from their fewness and our long companionship. And also in themselves, for these months unshieldedly open to the flaming sun and bullying wind had worn and refined them into individuals. In such a mob of unaccustomed soldiery, British, Australian and Indian, they went as strange and timid as myself. Distinguished also by grime, for with weeks of wearing their clothes had been molded to them by sweat and use and had become rather integuments than wrappings. But these others were really soldiers, a novelty after 2 years' irregularity. And it came upon me freshly how the secret of uniform was to make a crowd solid, dignified, impersonal, to give it the singleness and tautness of an upstanding man. This death's livery which walled its bearers from ordinary life, was sign that they had sold their wills and bodies to the state, and contracted themselves into a service not the less abject for that its beginning was voluntary. Some of them had obeyed the instinct of lawlessness, some were hungry, others thirsted for glamour, for the supposed color of a military life, but, of them all, those only received satisfaction who had sought to degrade themselves. For to the peace eye they were below humanity. Only women with a leck were allured by those witnessing clothes, the soldiers' pay, not sustenance like a laborer's, but pocket money, seemed most profitably spent when it let them drink sometimes and forget. Convicts had violence put upon them. Slaves might be free, if they could, in intention. But the soldier assigned his owner the 24 hours use of his body, and sole conduct of his mind and passions. A convict had license to hate the rule which confined him, and all humanity outside, if he were greedy in hate, but the sulking soldier was a bad soldier, indeed, no soldier. His affections must be hired pieces on the chessboard of the king. The strange power of war which made us all as a duty so demean ourselves. These Australians, shouldering me in unceremonious horseplay, had put off half civilization with their civil clothes. They were dominant tonight, too sure of themselves to be careful, and yet, as they lazily swaggered those quick bodies, all curves with never a straight line, but with old and disillusioned eyes, and yet, I felt them thin-tempered, hollow. Instinctive. Always going to do great things, with the disquieting suppleness of blades half-drawn from the scabbard. Disquieting, not dreadful. The English fellows were not instinctive, nor negligent like the Australians, but held themselves, with a slow-eyed, almost sheepish care. They were prim in dress, and quiet, going shyly in pairs. The Australians stood in groups and walked singly, the British clung two and two, in a celibate friendliness which expressed the level of the ranks, the commonness of their army clothes. Holding together, they called it, a wartime yearning to keep within 4 ears such thoughts as were deep enough to hurt. About the soldiers hung the Arabs, gravely gazing men from another sphere. My crooked duty had banished me among them for 2 years. Tonight I was nearer to them than to the troops, and I resented it, as shameful. The intruding contrast mixed with longing for home, to sharpen my faculties and make fertile my distaste, till not merely did I see the unlikeness of race, and hear the unlikeness of language, but I learned to pick between their smells, the heavy, standing, curdled sourness of dried sweat in cotton, over the Arab crowds. And the feral smell of English soldiers, that hot pissy aura of thronged men in woolen clothes, a tart pungency, breath-catching, ammoniacal, a fervent fermenting naphtha smell. Chapter 119. Our war was ended. Even though we slept that night in Kiswi, for the Arabs told us the roads were dangerous, and we had no wish to die stupidly in the dark at the gate of Damascus. The sporting Australians saw the campaign as a point-to-point, with Damascus the post. But in reality we were all under Allenby, now, and the victory had been the logical fruit solely of his genius, and Bartholomew's pains. Their tactical scheme properly put the Australians north and west of Damascus, across its railways, before the southern column might enter it, and we, the Arab leaders, had waited for the slower British partly because Allenby never questioned our fulfilling what was ordered. Power lay in his calm assumption that he would receive as perfect obedience as he gave trust. He hoped we would be present at the entry, partly because he knew how much more than a mere trophy Damascus was to the Arabs, partly for prudential reasons. Faisal's movement made the enemy country friendly to the Allies as they advanced, enabling convoys to go up without escort, towns to be administered without garrison. In their envelopment of Damascus the Australians might be forced, despite orders, to enter the town. If anyone resisted them it would spoil the future. One night was given us to make the Damascenes receive the British army as their allies. This was a revolution in behavior, if not in opinion, but Faisal's Damascus committee had for months been prepared to take over the reins when the Turks crashed. We had only to get in touch with them, to tell them the movements of the Allies, and what was required. So as dusk deepened Nasir sent the Ruala horse into the town, to find Ali Riza, the chairman of our committee, or Shukri el-Ayyubi, his assistant, telling them that relief would be available on the morrow, if they constructed a government at once. As a matter of fact it had been done at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, before we took action. Ali Riza was absent, put in command at the last moment by the Turks of the retreat of their army from Galilee before Chauvel, but Shukri found unexpected support from the Algerian brothers, Mohammed Said and Abd el-Kader. With the help of then retainers the Arab flag was on the town hall before sunset as the last echelons of Germans and Turks defiled past. They say the hindmost general saluted it, ironically. I dissuaded Nasir from going in. This would be a night of confusion, and it would better serve his dignity if he entered serenely at dawn. He and Nuri Shah Alan intercepted the second body of Ruala camel men, who had started out with me from Dira this morning, and sent them all forward into Damascus, to support the Ruala sheiks. So by midnight, when we went to rest, we had 4,000 of our armed men in the town. I wanted to sleep, for my work was coming on the morrow, but I could not. Damascus was the climax of our 2 years' uncertainty, and my mind was distracted by tags of all the ideas which had been used or rejected in that time. Also Kiswi was stifling with the exhalations of too many trees, too many plants, too many human beings, a microcosm of the crowded world in front of us. As the Germans left Damascus they fired the dumps and ammunition stores, so that every few minutes we were jangled by explosions, whose first shock set the sky white with flame. At each such roar the earth seemed to shake. We would lift our eyes to the north and see the pale sky prick out suddenly in sheaves of yellow points, as the shells, thrown to terrific heights from each bursting magazine, in their turn burst like clustered rockets. I turned to Sterling and muttered, "Damascus is burning," sick to think of the great town in ashes as the price of freedom. When dawn came we drove to the head of the ridge, which stood over the oasis of the city, afraid to look north for the ruins we expected, but, instead of ruins, the silent gardens stood blurred green with river mist, in whose setting shimmered the city, beautiful as ever, like a pearl in the morning sun. The uproar of the night had shrunk to a stiff tall column of smoke, which rose in sullen blackness from the storeyard by Kadam, terminus of the Hejaz line. We drove down the straight banked road through the watered fields, in which the peasants were just beginning their day's work. A galloping horseman checked at our headcloths in the car, with a merry salutation, holding out a bunch of yellow grapes. "Good news, Damascus salutes you." He came from Shukri. Nasir was just beyond us, to him we carried the tidings, that he might have the honorable entry, a privilege of his 50 battles. With Nuri Shah Alan beside him, he asked a final gallop from his horse, and vanished down the long road in a cloud of dust, which hung reluctantly in the air between the water splashes. To give him a fair start, Sterling and I found a little stream, cool in the depths of a steep channel. By it we stopped, to wash and shave. Some Indian troopers peered at us and our car and its ragged driver's army shorts and tunic. I was in pure Arab dress, Sterling, but for his head covering, was all British staff officer. Their NCO, an obtuse and bad-tempered person, thought he had taken prisoners. When delivered from his arrest we judged we might go after Nasir. Quite quietly we drove up the long street to the government buildings on the bank of the Barada. The way was packed with people, lined solid on the sidewalks, in the road, at the windows and on the balconies or housetops. Many were crying, a few cheered faintly, some bolder ones cried our names, but mostly they looked and looked, joy shining in their eyes. A movement like a long sigh from gate to heart of the city, marked our course. At the town hall things were different. Its steps and stairs were packed with a swaying mob, yelling, embracing, dancing, singing. They crushed a way for us to the antechamber, where were the gleaming Nasir, and Nuri Shah Alan, seated. On either side of them stood Abd el-Kader, my old enemy, and Muhammad said, his brother. I was dumb with amazement. Muhammad said leaped forward and shouted that they, grandsons of Abd el-Kader, the emir, with Shukri el-Ayyubi, of Saladin's house, had formed the government and proclaimed Hussein, king of the Arabs yesterday. Into the ears of the humbled Turks and Germans. While he ranted I turned to Shukri, who was no statesman, but a beloved man, almost a martyr in the people's eyes, because of what he had suffered from Jemal. He told me how the Algerians, alone of all Damascus, had stood by the Turks till they saw them running. Then, with their Algerians, they had burst in upon Faisal's committee where it sat in secret, and brutally assumed control. They were fanatics, whose ideas were theological, not logical, and I turned to Nasir, meaning through him to check their impudence now from the start, but there came a diversion. The screaming press about us parted as though a ram drove through, men going down to right and left among ruined chairs and tables, while the terrific roaring of a familiar voice triumphed, and stilled them dead. In the cleared space were Atta Abu Tayi and Sultan el-Atrash, chief of the Druzes, tearing one another. Their followers bounded forward, while I jumped in to drive them apart, crashing upon Muhammad el-Dylan, filled with the same purpose. Together we broke them, and forced Atta back a pace, while Hussein el-Atrash hustled the lighter Sultan into the crowd, and away to a side room. Atta was too blind with rage to be fairly conscious. We got him into the great state hall of the building, an immense, pompous, gilded room, quiet as the grave, since all doors but ours were locked. We pushed him into a chair and held him, while in his fits he foamed and shouted till his voice cracked, his body twitching and jerking, arms lunging wildly at any weapon within reach, his face swollen with blood, bareheaded. The long hair streaming over his eyes. The old man had been hit first, by Sultan, and his ungovernable spirit, drunk with a lifetime's wine of self-will, raved to wash out the insult in Drew's blood. Zal came in, with the hupsai. And the 4 or 5 of us united to restrain him, but it was half an hour before he calmed enough to hear us speaking, and another half hour before we had his promise to leave his satisfaction, for 3 days, in the hands of Muhammad and myself. I went out and had Sultan el-Atrash taken secretly from the town with all speed, and then looked round for Nasir and Abd el-Kader, to set in order their government. They were gone. The Algerians had persuaded Nasir to their house for refreshment. It was a good hap, for there were more pressing public things. We must prove the old days over, a native government in power, for this Shukri would be my best instrument, as acting governor. So in the blue mist, we set off to show ourselves, his enlargement in authority itself a banner of revolution for the citizens. When we came in there had been some miles of people greeting us, now there were thousands for every 100 then. Every man, woman and child in this city of 250,000 souls seemed in the streets, waiting only the spark of our appearance to ignite their spirits. Damascus went mad with joy. The men tossed up their tarbushes to cheer, the women tore off their veils. Householders threw flowers, hangings, carpets, into the road before us, their wives leaned, screaming with laughter, through the lattices and splashed us with bath-dippers of scent. Poor dervishes made themselves our running footmen in front and behind, howling and cutting themselves with frenzy. And over the local cries and the shrilling of women came the measured roar of men's voices chanting, Faisal, Nasir, Shukri, Urans, in waves which began here, rolled along the squares, through the market down long streets to East Gate. Round the wall, back up the Maidan. And grew to a wall of shouts around us by the citadel. They told me Chauvel was coming, our cars met in the southern outskirts. I described the excitement in the city, and how our new government could not guarantee administrative services before the following day, when I would wait on him, to discuss his needs and mine. Meanwhile I made myself responsible for public order, only begging him to keep his men outside, because tonight would see such carnival as the town had not held for 600 years, and its hospitality might pervert their discipline. Chauvel unwillingly followed my lead, his hesitations ruled by my certainty. Like Barrow, he had no instructions what to do with the captured city. And as we had taken possession, knowing our road, with clear purpose, prepared processes, and assets in hand, he had no choice but to let us carry on. His chief of staff who did his technical work, Godwin, a soldier, was delighted to shelve the responsibility of civil government. His advocacy confirmed my assumption. Indeed, it was confirmed in Chauvel's next words, which asked liberty for himself to drive round the town. I gave it so gladly that he asked if it would be convenient for him to make formal entry with his troops on the morrow. I said certainly, and we thought a little of the route. There flashed into my head the pleasure of our men at Dera when Barrow saluted their flag, and I quoted it as an example good to follow before the town hall when he marched past. It was a casual thought of mine, but he saw significance in it, and a grave difficulty if he saluted any flag except the British. I wanted to make faces at his folly, but instead, in kindness I kept him company, seeing equal difficulty in his passing the Arab flag deliberately not noticed. We stumbled round this problem, while the joyful, unknowing crowd cheered us. As a compromise I suggested we leave out the town hall, and invent another route, passing, let us say, by the post office. I meant this for farce, since my patience had broken down, but he took it seriously, as a helpful idea. And in return would concede a point for my sake and the Arabs. In place of an entry, he would make a march through. It meant that instead of going in the middle he would go at the head, or instead of the head, the middle. I forgot, or did not well hear, which, for I should not have cared if he had crawled under or flown over his troops, or split himself to march both sides. Chapter 120. While we discussed ceremonial antics a world of work waited, inside and outside, for each of us. It was bitter, playing down to such a part, also the one game of grab left a bad taste in my mouth, spoiling my entry much as I spoiled Chauvel's. The airy birds of promise so freely sent to the Arabs in England's day of need were homing now, to her confusion. However, the course I mapped for us was proving correct. Another 12 hours, and we should be safe, with the Arabs in so strong a place that their hand might hold through the long wrangle and appetite of politics about to break out about our luscious spoil. We sneaked back to the town hall, to grapple with Abd el-Kader, but he had not returned. I sent for him, and for his brother, and for Nasir, and got a curt reply that they were sleeping. So should I have been, but instead 4 or 5 of us were eating a snatch meal in the gaudy salon, sitting on gold chairs, which writhed, about a gold table whose legs also writhed obscenely. I explained pointedly to the messenger what I meant. He disappeared, and in a few minutes a cousin of the Algerians came up, very agitated, and said they were on their way. This was an open lie, but I replied that it was well, since in half an hour I should have fetched British troops and looked carefully for them. He ran off in haste, and Nuri Shah Alan asked quietly what I meant to do. I said I would depose Abd el-Kader and Muhammad said, and appoint Shukri in their place till Faisal came, and I did it in this gentle fashion because I was loath to hurt Nasir's feelings, and had no strength of my own if men resisted. He asked if the English would not come. I replied certainly, but the sorrow was that afterwards they might not go. He thought a moment, and said, "You shall have the Ruala if you do all your will, and quickly." Without waiting, the old man went out to muster me his tribe. The Algerians came to the tryst with their bodyguards, and with murder in their eyes, but, on the way, saw Nuri Shalan's massed lowering tribesmen. Nuri said, with his regulars in the square, and within, my reckless guardsmen lounging in the antechamber. They saw clearly that the game was up, yet it was a stormy meeting. In my capacity as deputy for Faisal I pronounced their civil government of Damascus abolished, and named Shukri Pasha Ayyubi as acting military governor. Nuri said was to be commandant of troops, Azmi, adjutant general. Jemal, chief of public security. Muhammad said, in a bitter reply, denounced me as a Christian and an Englishman, and called on Nasir to assert himself. Poor Nasir, far out of his depth, could only sit and look miserable at this falling out of friends. Abd el-Kader leaped up and cursed me virulently, puffing himself to a white heat of passion. His motives seemed dogmatic, irrational, so I took no heed. This maddened him yet more. Suddenly he leaped forward with drawn dagger. Like a flash Otto was on him, the old man bristling with the chained-up fury of the morning, and longing for a fight. It would have been heaven, for him, to have shredded someone there and then with his great fingers. Abd el-Kader was daunted. And Nuri Shah Alan closed the debate by saying to the carpet, so enormous and violent a carpet it was, that the Ruala were mine, and no questions asked. The Algerians rose and swept in high dudgeon from the hall. I was persuaded they should be seized and shot, but could not make myself fear their power of mischief, nor set the Arabs an example of precautionary murder as part of politics. We passed to work. Our aim was an Arab government, with foundations large and native enough to employ the enthusiasm and self-sacrifice of the rebellion, translated into terms of peace. We had to save some of the old prophetic personality upon a substructure to carry that 90% of the population who had been too solid to rebel, and on whose solidity the new state must rest. Rebels, especially successful rebels, were of necessity bad subjects and worse governors. Faisal's sorry duty would be to rid himself of his war friends, and replace them by those elements which had been most useful to the Turkish government. Nasir was too little a political philosopher to feel this. Nuri said new, and Nuri Shah Alan. Quickly they collected the nucleus of a staff, and plunged ahead as a team. History told us the steps were humdrum, appointments, offices, and departmental routine. First the police. A commandant and assistants were chosen, districts allotted, provisional wages, indents, uniform, responsibilities. The machine began to function. Then came a complaint of water supply. The conduit was foul with dead men and animals. An inspectorate, with its labor corps, solved this. Emergency regulations were drafted. The day was drawing in, the world was in the streets, riotous. We chose an engineer to superintend the powerhouse, charging him at all pains to illuminate the town that night. The resumption of street lighting would be our most signal proof of peace. It was done, and to its shining quietness much of the order of the first evening of victory belonged, though our new police were zealous, and the grave sheiks of the many quarters helped their patrol. Then sanitation. The streets were full of the debris of the broken army, derelict carts and cars, baggage, material, corpses. Typhus, dysentery and pellagra were rife among the Turks, and sufferers had died in every shadow along the line of march. Nuri prepared scavenger gangs to make a first clearing of the pestilent roads and open places, and rationed out his doctors among the hospitals, with promises of drugs and food next day, if any could be found. Next a fire brigade. The local engines had been smashed by the Germans, and the army storehouses still burned, endangering the town. Mechanics were cried for, and trained men, pressed into service, sent down to circumscribe the flames. Then the prisons. Warders and inmates had vanished from them together. Shukri made a virtue of that, by amnesties, civil, political, military. The citizens must be disarmed, or at least dissuaded from carrying rifles. A proclamation was the treatment, followed up by good-humored banter merging into police activity. This would effect our end without malice in 3 or 4 days. Relief work. The destitute had been half-starved for days. A distribution of the damaged food from the army storehouses was arranged. After that food must be provided for the general. The city might be starving in 2 days, there were no stocks in Damascus. To get temporary supplies from the near villages was easy, if we restored confidence, safeguarded the roads, and replaced the transport animals, which the Turks had carried off, by others from the pool of captures. The British would not share out. We parted with our own animals, our army transport. The routine feeding of the place needed the railway. Pointsmen, drivers, firemen, shopmen, traffic staff had to be found and re-engaged immediately. Then the telegraphs, the junior staff were available, directors must be found, and linesmen sent out to put the system in repair. The post could wait a day or two, but quarters for ourselves and the British were urgent, and so were the resumption of trade, the opening of shops, and their corollary needs of markets and acceptable currency. The currency was horrible. The Australians had looted millions in Turkish notes, the only stuff in use, and had reduced it to no value by throwing it about. One trooper gave a £500 note to a lad who held his horse 3 minutes. Young tried his prentice hand at bolstering it with the last remnant of our Aqaba gold, but new prices had to be fixed, which involved the printing press, and hardly was that settled when a newspaper was demanded. Also, as heirs of the Turkish government, the Arabs must maintain its records of fisc and property, with the register of souls. Whereas the old staffs were taking jubilant holiday. Requisitions plagued us while we were yet half-hungry. Chauvel had no forage and he had 40,000 horses to feed. If forage was not brought him he would go seek it and the new-lit freedom puff out like a match. Syria's status hung on his satisfaction. And we should find little mercy in his judgments. Taken all in all, this was a busy evening. We reached an apparent end by sweeping delegation of office, too often, in our haste, to hands unworthy, and by drastic cutting down of efficiency. Sterling the suave, Young the capable, and Kirkbride the summary back to their best the open-minded power of the Arab officers. Our aim was a facade rather than a fitted building. It was run up so furiously well that when I left Damascus on October the 4th the Syrians had their de facto government, which endured for 2 years, without foreign advice, in an occupied country wasted by war. And against the will of important elements among the Allies. Later I was sitting alone in my room, working and thinking out as firm a way as the turbulent memories of the day allowed. When the mutins began to send their call of last prayer through the moist night over the illuminations of the feasting city. One, with a ringing voice of special sweetness, cried into my window from a near mosque. I found myself involuntarily distinguishing his words: God alone is great, I testify there are no gods, but God, and Muhammad his prophet. Come to prayer, come to security. God alone is great, there is no God, but God. At the close he dropped his voice 2 tones, almost a speaking level, and softly added, and he is very good to us this day, O people of Damascus. The clamor hushed, as everyone seemed to obey the call to prayer on this their first night of perfect freedom. While my fancy, in the overwhelming pause, showed me my loneliness and lack of reason in their movement, since only for me, of all the hearers, was the event sorrowful and the phrase meaningless. Chapter 121. Quiveringly a citizen woke me, with word that Abd el-Qadir was making rebellion. I sent over to Nuri said, glad the Algerian fool was digging his own pit. He had called his men, told them these sharifs were only English creatures, and conjured them to strike a blow for religion and the caliph while there was yet time. They, simple retainers with an ingrained habit of obedience, took his word for it, and set out to make war on us. The Druzes, for whose tardy services I had this night sharply refused reward, listened to him. They were sectaries, caring nothing for Islam or Caliph or Turk, or Abd el-Qadir, but an anti-Christian rising meant plunder, and perhaps Maronites to kill. So they ran to arms, and began to burst open shops. We held our hands till day, for our numbers were not so great that we could throw away our advantage in weapons, and fight in the dark which made a fool and a man equal. But when dawn hinted itself we moved men to the upper suburb, and drove the rioters towards the river districts of the town centre, where the streets crossed bridges, and were easy to control. Then we saw how small the trouble was. Nuri said had covered the parades with machine gun sections, who, in one long rattle of fire, barraged them across to blank walls. Past these our sweeping parties urged the dissident. The appalling noise made the Druzes drop their booty and flee down side alleys. Muhammad said, not so brave as his brother, was taken in his house, and jailed in the town hall. Again I itched to shoot him, but waited till we had the other. However, Abd el-Qadir broke back into the country. At noon it was all over. When things began I had called up Chauvel, who at once offered his troops. I thanked him, and asked that a second company of horse be drafted to the Turkish barracks, the nearest post, to stand by against call, but the fighting was too petty for that call. Its best consequence was among the pressmen in an hotel whose wall was the stop-block of one barrage. They had not dipped their pens in much blood during this campaign, which had run faster than their cars. But here was a godsend at their bedroom windows, and they wrote and telegraphed till Allenby, away in Ramla, took fright, sending me a press dispatch which recalled 2 Balkan wars and 5 Armenian massacres. But never carnage like today's, the streets paved with corpses, the gutters running blood, and the swollen Barada spouting crimson through all the fountains in the city. My reply was a death roll, naming the 5 victims, and the hurts of the 10 wounded. Of the casualties 3 fell to Kirkbride's ruthless revolver. The Druzes were expelled from the city, and lost horses and rifles at the hands of the citizens of Damascus, whom we had formed for the emergency into civic guards. These gave the town a warlike look, patrolling till afternoon, when things grew quiet again, and street traffic normal, with sweetmeats, iced drinks, flowers, and little Hijaz flags being hawked round by their peddlers as before. We returned to the organization of the public services. An amusing event for me, personally, was an official call from the Spanish consul, a polished English-speaking individual, who introduced himself as chargé d'affaires for 17 nationalities, including all combatants except the Turks, and was in vain search of the constituted legal authority of the town. At lunch an Australian doctor implored me, for the sake of humanity, to take notice of the Turkish hospital. I ran over in my mind our 3 hospitals, the military, the civil, the missionary, and told him they were cared for as well as our means allowed. The Arabs could not invent drugs, nor could Chauvel give them to us. He enlarged further. describing an enormous range of filthy buildings without a single medical officer or orderly, packed with dead and dying, mainly dysentery cases, but at least some typhoid, and, it was only to be hoped, no typhus or cholera. In his descriptions I recognized the Turkish barracks, occupied by 2 Australian companies of town reserve. Were there sentries at the gates? Yes, he said, that was the place, but, it was full of Turkish sick. I walked across and parleyed with the guard, who distrusted my single appearance on foot. They had orders to keep out all natives lest they massacre the patients, a misapprehension of the Arab fashion of making war. At last my English speech got me past the little lodge whose garden was filled with 200 wretched prisoners in exhaustion and despair. Through the great door of the barrack I called, up the dusty echoing corridors. No one answered. The huge, deserted, sun-trapping court was squalid with rubbish. The guard told me that thousands of prisoners from here had yesterday gone to a camp beyond the town. Since then no one had come in or out. I walked over to the far thoroughfare, on whose left was a shuttered lobby, black after the blazing sunlight of the plastered court. I stepped in, to meet a sickening stench, and, as my eyes grew open, a sickening sight. The stone floor was covered with dead bodies side by side, some in full uniform, some in underclothing, some stark naked. There might be 30 there, and they crept with rats, who had gnawed wet red galleries into them. A few were corpses nearly fresh, perhaps only a day or 2 old, others must have been there for long. Of some the flesh, going putrid, was yellow and blue and black. Many were already swollen twice or thrice life-width, their fat heads laughing with black mouth across jaws harsh with stubble. Of others the softer parts were fallen in. A few had burst open, and were liquescent with decay. Beyond was the vista of a great room, from which I thought there came a groan. I trod over to it, across the soft mat of bodies, whose clothing, yellow with dung, crackled dryly under me. Inside the ward the air was raw and still, and the dressed battalion of filled beds so quiet that I thought these 2 were dead, each man rigid on his stinking pallet, from which liquid muck had dripped down to stiffen on the cemented floor. I picked forward a little between their lines, holding my white skirts about me, not to dip my bare feet in their puddled running, when suddenly I heard a sigh and turned abruptly to meet the open beady eyes of an outstretched man, while Aman, pity, pardon, rustled from the twisted lips. There was a brown waver as several tried to lift their hands, and a thin fluttering like withered leaves, as they vainly fell back again upon their beds. No one of them had strength to speak, but there was something which made me laugh at their whispering in unison, as if by command. No doubt occasion had been given them to rehearse their appeal all the last 2 days, each time a curious trooper had peered into their halls and gone away. I ran through the arch into the garden, across which Australians were picketed in lines, and asked them for a working party. They refused. Tools. They had none. Doctors. Busy. Kirkbride came, the Turkish doctors, we heard, were upstairs. We broke open a door to find 7 men in nightgowns sitting on unmade beds in a great room, boiling toffee. We convinced them quickly that it would be wise to sort out living and dead, and prepare me, in half an hour, a tally of their numbers. Kirkbride's heavy frame and boots fitted him to oversee this work, while I saw Ali Baza Pasha, and asked him to detail us one of the 4 Arab army doctors. When he came we pressed the 50 fittest prisoners in Tai Lodge as labor party. We bought biscuits and fed them, then armed them with Turkish tools and set them in the backyard to dig a common grave. The Australian officers protested it was an unfit place, the smell arising from which might drive them from their garden. My jerky reply was that I hoped to God it would. It was cruelty to work men so tired and ill as our miserable Turks, but haste gave us no choice. By the kicks and blows of their victor-serving non-commissioned officers they were at last got obedient. We began operations on a 6-foot hole to one side of the garden. This hole we tried to deepen, but beneath was a cement floor. So I said it would do if they enlarged the edges. Nearby was much quicklime, which would cover the bodies effectually. The doctors told us of 56 dead, 200 dying, 700 not dangerously ill. We formed a stretcher party to carry down the corpses, of which some were lifted easily, others had to be scraped up piecemeal with shovels. The bearers were hardly strong enough to stand at their work. Indeed, before the end, we had added the bodies of 2 to the heap of dead men in the pit. The trench was small for them, but so fluid was the mass that each newcomer, when tipped in, fell softly, just jellying out the edges of the pile a little with his weight. Before the work finished it was midnight, and I dismissed myself to bed, exhausted, since I had not slept 3 hours since we left Deira 4 days ago. Kirkbride, a boy in years, doing 2 men's work these days, stayed to finish the burying, and scatter earth and lime over the grave. At the hotel waited a bunch of urgent matters, some death sentences, a new justiciary, a famine in barley for the morrow if the train did not work. Also a complaint from Chauvel that some of the Arab troops had been slack about saluting Australian officers. Chapter 122. By morning, after the sudden fashion of troubles, they were ended and our ship sailing under a clear sky. The armored cars came in, and the pleasure of our men's sedate faces heartened me. Pisani arrived, and made me laugh, so bewildered was the good soldier by the political hubbub. He gripped his military duty as a rudder to steer him through. Damascus was normal, the shops open, street merchants trading, the electric tramcars restored, grain and vegetables and fruits coming in well. The streets were being watered to lay the terrible dust of 3 warriors' lorry traffic. The crowds were slow and happy, and numbers of British troops were wandering in the town, unarmed. The telegraph was restored with Palestine, and with Beirut, which the Arabs had occupied in the night. As long ago as Wage I had warned them, when they took Damascus to leave Lebanon for Sop to the French and take Tripoli instead. Since as a port it outweighed Beirut, and England would have played the honest broker for it on their behalf in the peace settlement. So I was grieved by their mistake, yet glad they felt grown up enough to reject me. Even the hospital was better. I had urged Chauvel to take it over, but he would not. At the time I thought he meant to overstrain us, to justify his taking away our government of the town. However, since, I have come to feel that the trouble between us was a delusion of the ragged nerves which were jangling me to distraction these days. Certainly Chauvel won the last round, and made me feel mean, for when he heard that I was leaving he drove round with Godwin and thanked me outright for my help in his difficulties. Still, the hospital was improving of itself. 50 prisoners had cleaned the courtyard, burning the lousy rubbish. A second gang had dug another great grave pit in the garden, and were zealously filling it as opportunity offered. Others had gone through the wards, washing every patient, putting them into cleaner shirts, and reversing their mattresses to have a tolerably decent side-up. We had found food suitable for all but critical cases, and each ward had some Turkish-spoken orderly within hearing, if a sick man called. One room we had cleared, brushed out and disinfected, meaning to transfer into it the less ill cases, and do their room in turn. At this rate 3 days would have seen things very fit, and I was proudly contemplating other benefits when a medical major strode up and asked me shortly if I spoke English. With a brow of disgust for my skirts and sandals he said, "You're in charge." Modestly I smirked that in a way I was, and then he burst out, "Scandalous, disgraceful, outrageous, ought to be shot." At this onslaught I cackled out like a chicken, with the wild laughter of strain. It did feel extraordinarily funny to be so cursed just as I had been pluming myself on having bettered the apparently hopeless. The Major had not entered the charnel house of yesterday, nor smelt it, nor seen us burying those bodies of ultimate degradation, whose memory had started me up in bed, sweating and trembling, a few hours since. He glared at me, muttering, "Bloody brute." I hooted out again, and he smacked me over the face and stalked off, leaving me more ashamed than angry, for in my heart I felt he was right. And that anyone who pushed through to success a rebellion of the weak against their masters must come out of it so stained in estimation that afterward nothing in the world would make him feel clean. However, it was nearly over. When I got back to the hotel crowds were besetting it, and at the door stood a grey Rolls-Royce, which I knew for Allenby's. I ran in and found him there with Clayton and Cornwallis and other noble people. In 10 words he gave his approval to my having impertinently imposed Arab governments, here and at Dira, upon the chaos of victory. He confirmed the appointment of Ali Riza Rakabi as his military governor, under the orders of Faisal, his army commander, and regulated the Arab sphere and shovels. He agreed to take over my hospital and the working of the railway. In 10 minutes all the maddening difficulties had slipped away. Mistily I realized that the harsh days of my solitary battling had passed. The lone hand had won against the world's odds, and I might let my limbs relax in this dreamlike confidence and decision and kindness which were Allenby. Then we were told that Faisal's special train had just arrived from Dira. A message was hurriedly sent him by Young's mouth, and we waited till he came, upon a tide of cheering which beat up against our windows. It was fitting the two chiefs should meet for the first time in the heart of their victory. With myself still acting as the interpreter between them. Allenby gave me a telegram from the Foreign Office, recognizing to the Arabs the status of belligerents. And told me to translate it to the Emir, but none of us knew what it meant in English, let alone in Arabic, and Faisal, smiling through the tears which the welcome of his people had forced from him, put it aside to thank the commander-in-chief for the trust which had made him and his movement. They were a strange contrast, Faisal, large-eyed, colorless and worn, like a fine dagger, Allenby, gigantic and red and merry, fit representative of the power which had thrown a girdle of humor and strong dealing round the world. When Faisal had gone, I made to Allenby the last, and also I think the first, request I ever made him for myself, leave to go away. For a while he would not have it. But I reasoned, reminding him of his year-old promise, and pointing out how much easier the new law would be if my spur were absent from the people. In the end he agreed, and then at once I knew how much I was sorry. Epilogue. Damascus had not seemed a sheath for my sword, when I landed in Arabia, but its capture disclosed the exhaustion of my mainsprings of action. The strongest motive throughout had been a personal one, not mentioned here, but present to me, I think, every hour of these 2 years. Active pains and joys might fling up, like towers, among my days, but, refluent as air, this hidden urge reformed, to be the persisting element of life, till near the end. It was dead, before we reached Damascus. Next in force had been a pugnacious wish to win the war, yoked to the conviction that without Arab help England could not pay the price of winning its Turkish sector. When Damascus fell, the Eastern War, probably the whole war, drew to an end. Then I was moved by curiosity. Super Flumina Babylonis, read as a boy, had left me longing to feel myself the node of a national movement. We took Damascus, and I feared. More than 3 arbitrary days would have quickened in me a root of authority. There remained historical ambition, insubstantial as a motive by itself. I had dreamed, at the city school in Oxford, of hustling into form, while I lived, the new Asia which time was inexorably bringing upon us. Mecca was to lead to Damascus, Damascus to Anatolia, and afterwards to Baghdad, and then there was Yemen. Fantasies, these will seem, to such as are able to call my beginning an ordinary effort.